It began with a job nobody noticed, until everything depended on it. In the winter of 1944, while headlines would later focus on tanks, generals, and dramatic counterattacks, a quieter war unfolded beneath the snow and shell fire. It was fought with shovels, wire cutters, explosives, timber, and bare hands numbed by cold. This was the war of the combat engineers, and during the Battle of the Bulge, they became the difference between movement and paralysis, survival and collapse. When the German offensive erupted through the Ardennes, chaos spread faster than orders. Roads clogged with retreating units. Bridges suddenly became lifelines. Forests swallowed vehicles whole. Snow hid mines, demolitions, and danger alike. And in the middle of that confusion, combat engineers were thrown forward, not to hold ground, but to make war possible at all. They arrived before defenses were ready. They stayed after everyone else moved on. They worked under fire with tools instead of cover. Combat engineers did not fight for glory. They fought the terrain, the weather, and time itself. At the Bulge, every road mattered. Every bridge mattered more. Engineers blew bridges at the last possible moment, sometimes with enemy armor already in sight, racing against seconds that felt like hours. Charges were set by hand. Detonators were tested with shaking fingers. Retreating infantry crossed, and then the span vanished behind them in a roar of stone, steel, and water, buying minutes that became hours, hours that became days. Elsewhere, engineers built instead of destroyed. They threw bridges across icy rivers while artillery fell nearby. They repaired roads churned into mud and cratered by shell fire. They cleared mines buried beneath snow, so thin it gave no warning. They worked at night, by feel, counting steps, trusting memory, knowing one mistake meant death. The Ardennes was unforgiving. Snow filled foxholes as fast as they were dug. Explosives froze. Vehicles slid off roads and had to be recovered under fire. Engineers slept wherever they collapsed, beside bridges, in ditches, in the open, boots still on, tools still close. Many had not trained for mountain warfare. None had trained for this scale of chaos, and yet they adapted because there was no alternative. When American units were cut off, engineers reopened routes. When armor stalled, engineers cleared paths. When rivers blocked movement, engineers crossed them first. They fought like infantry when needed, defending bridgeheads and roadblocks with rifles and machine guns, then returned to their tools without pause. The line between soldier and specialist disappeared completely. At places like Bastogne, St. Vith, and countless unnamed crossings, combat engineers worked under constant threat. German artillery targeted bridges relentlessly. Infantry probed engineer positions, knowing how vital their work was. Still, the work continued. Every bridge held or destroyed at the right moment reshaped the flow of the battle. The Bulge was not decided by a single breakthrough or stand. It was decided by movement. And movement depended on engineers. They made retreat possible without collapse. They made counterattack possible without delay. They turned terrain from an enemy into a tool. When the weather cleared and Allied momentum returned, it was engineers who cleared the way forward again, repairing roads, building crossings, and keeping supply flowing through a landscape still soaked in winter and fire. Their losses were heavy. Many were killed not in firefights, but while working, exposed, focused, and unable to take cover. Others were wounded by mines they never saw. Some disappeared beneath collapsed bridges or frozen rivers. Their names rarely appear in bold type, but their absence would have been felt immediately. Without combat engineers, the Battle of the Bulge would have unfolded very differently. Tanks would have stalled, units would have been trapped, counterattacks would have arrived too late. This is the story of those who shaped the battlefield without commanding it. Of soldiers whose victories were measured not in captured ground, but in roads opened, bridges denied, and time bought under impossible pressure. Tonight, we return to the frozen roads and rivers of the Ardennes, not to follow generals on maps, but to follow the men who made those maps usable at all, to the engineers who worked while others fought, and fought while others moved on, to the quiet backbone of the Bulge. Before we go any further, let me bring you into this moment as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time has found you there? Is it late and still, early morning, or that calm hour when everything finally slows down. If hearing about the unseen work, the quiet courage, and the steady hands behind history helps you unwind, focus, or feel grounded at the end of the day, consider subscribing, so these long, unhurried stories are always here for you when you want history told from the inside out. Settle in. This war was built and broken by engineers. December 10th, 1944. A cold Tuesday morning in Spa, Belgium. Private Robert Billington of Company A, 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, stood in ankle-deep mud watching his squad unload timber from a deuce-and-a-half truck. Bridge materials, mine detectors still in their factory grease, coils of wire that would string field telephones between command posts that didn't exist yet. Around him, engineers joked about their assignment to what everyone called the Ghost Front, 85 miles of quiet forest where nothing ever happened. Billington had been in Belgium for 6 weeks. He'd built 3 Bailey bridges, cleared 2 roads, and never fired his rifle in anger. He was 19 years old. In 6 days, he would discover what it meant to be a combat engineer. The American combat engineer in December 1944 occupied a strange position in the military hierarchy. Not quite infantry, not quite support troops. Something in between that nobody, including the engineers themselves, fully understood. The Army had organized them into battalions of roughly 600 men. Smaller than infantry battalions, but larger than most specialist units. Each company consisted of 6 officers and 187 enlisted men. They carried rifles like infantrymen. They carried Bangalore torpedoes and blocks of TNT like sappers. Their training had been split, 60% construction and demolition skills, 40% basic infantry tactics. On paper, they existed to build bridges the Army needed and blow up bridges the enemy needed. In practice, they were the Swiss Army knife of military units, expected to do whatever the situation demanded. Across the Ardennes front that December, 6 combat engineer battalions were spread impossibly thin. The 291st, the 51st, the 202nd, the 159th, the 296th, the engineers of 9th Armored Division. Together, they covered 85 miles of forest, river valleys, and dirt roads that wound through the densest terrain in Western Europe. Corps headquarters had assigned them to routine work, road maintenance, bridge inspection, keeping supply lines open for the divisions that held the quiet sector. The engineers knew this country intimately now. They'd surveyed every road. They'd calculated the weight limits of every bridge. They'd identified every ford, every defile, every place where terrain channeled movement. They possessed detailed knowledge that would soon become the difference between American defeat and German failure. But in early December, none of them suspected they would need that knowledge for anything but paperwork. Strength reports showed most engineer units at 85 to 95% of authorized strength, good numbers by late 1944 standards. The problem was that 30% of those men were replacements with less than 3 months in theater. Some had arrived in November. Many had never heard artillery fired in anger. They knew how to calculate the explosive charge needed to drop a bridge. They knew how to operate a bulldozer. They knew how to string wire and lay mines according to field manual diagrams. What they didn't know was how to fight for their lives while doing all those things simultaneously. The equipment they carried told the story of their dual identity. A combat engineer's basic load weighed between 20 and 30 pounds, 10 to 15 pounds heavier than standard infantry, an M1 rifle with 8-round clips, a bayonet most figured they'd never use, 2 or 3 grenades, then the specialist gear, blocks of TNT wrapped in waxed paper, blasting caps and protective cases, detonation cord, wire cutters strong enough to slice through concertina, entrenching tools that doubled as weapons in desperate moments. Some carried Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosive designed to clear wire obstacles. Others hauled mine detectors, bulky devices that squealed when passed over buried metal. The contradiction was built into every piece of gear. You were a builder, you were a fighter. You were expected to be both, perfectly, under conditions where most men struggled to be either. December 14th. Captain James Gamble of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion sat in a farmhouse near Trois Ponts, reviewing defensive assignments that existed more on paper than in reality. His company was responsible for maintaining 3 bridges across the Amblive River and preparing them for demolition if, the briefing always said if, never when, German forces somehow broke through. The preparatory work was supposed to be careful, methodical, measure the bridge structure, calculate the exact placement for charges, drill holes for explosives, prepare detonation systems with redundant backups, then wait. Gamble had been waiting since October. The TNT sat in a supply dump 2 miles away. The bridges stood intact, carrying American supply trucks toward the front. Everything was routine. Everything was ready. Everything was about to become irrelevant. That same day, Private First Class Eugene Garrett sat in a tent outside Hounsfeld, writing a letter home to Pennsylvania. "Dear Mom," he wrote in the careful script of someone who'd left school at 16 to work in his father's garage. "I know you worry, but there's nothing to worry about here. We're so far from the fighting, we might as well be in England still. Yesterday we built a shower facility for the infantry boys. Today we're improving a road. Tomorrow, who knows? Maybe we'll fix somebody's barn. Some war this is turning out to be." Garrett was a member of Company B, 254th Engineer Combat Battalion. He was 21 years old. He had a talent for fixing engines and a reputation for complaining about easy duty. In 2 days, his unit would cease to exist as an organized fighting force. The Army's doctrine for employing combat engineers rested on certain assumptions that made sense in staff colleges and fell apart in contact with reality. Engineers were supposed to support attacks by clearing obstacles and building crossings. They were supposed to delay enemy advances by creating obstacles and destroying crossings. They were supposed to do these things for a few hours, maybe a day or two, before being relieved by infantry. Nobody had seriously planned for what would happen if engineers became the infantry, if they had to hold defensive positions not for hours but for days, not in support of other units, but as the only unit standing between German armor and Allied collapse. The field manuals didn't cover that scenario. The training hadn't prepared anyone for it. When it happened, the engineers would have to improvise everything. December 15th. Evening. Across the Ardennes, combat engineers settled into another quiet night. Some played cards in farmhouse billets. Others wrote letters or cleaned weapons with the bored thoroughness of soldiers who had nothing else to do. In command posts, officers reviewed routine orders for the next day's work. Bridge maintenance, road repair, mine clearing practice for new replacements. The kind of unexciting duty that let men think about home and Christmas packages, and the rumor that the war might be over by spring. Lieutenant Aloysius D'Amato of Company A, 291st Engineers, marked December 15th on his calendar. One more day in what everyone called the rest sector. One more day of being an engineer instead of a rifleman. He went to sleep that night expecting December 16th to be exactly like December 15th. 0530, December 16th, 1944. The night sky over the Ardennes erupted in fire. 1,800 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously across an 85-mile front. Shells screamed into villages where American engineers slept. High explosive rounds demolished farmhouses being used as billets. The barrage walked methodically through areas where intelligence had identified American positions. In Hounsfeld, Private Garrett was blown out of his cot by a near miss that collapsed half his tent. In Lossheim, engineers stumbled into the pre-dawn darkness trying to understand what was happening. In Malmedy, Captain Gamble grabbed his rifle and ran toward his command post while the earth shook beneath his feet. The quiet sector had just exploded. For the combat engineers of the Ardennes, the easy war was over. The real war, the one they weren't trained for, weren't prepared for, but would somehow have to win, had just begun. And in those first confused moments, as artillery fell and men shouted and the certainty of yesterday dissolved into the chaos of now, the American combat engineer began a transformation that would determine the outcome of Adolf Hitler's last great gamble in the West. 0930, December 16th. The Lossheim Gap. Lieutenant Harold Billington, no relation to Private Robert Billington but a fellow member of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, stood at a roadblock position, trying to make sense of reports filtering through disrupted communication lines. German infantry in American uniforms, paratroopers dropping behind the lines, armor pushing west faster than seemed possible. The reports contradicted each other, but they all agreed on one thing: something massive was happening. Billington commanded a platoon of 32 men whose primary mission until 30 minutes ago had been maintaining a secondary supply road. Now a frantic radio message instructed him to establish defensive positions and hold until relieved. The message didn't specify where to hold, or against what, or for how long. Billington looked at his men, carpenters, mechanics, equipment operators, a few with infantry training, most without. He looked at the road stretching east toward Germany. Then he started giving orders that would transform construction workers into the first line of American defense. The transformation happened across the Ardennes, simultaneously as German forces crashed through what American intelligence had considered a quiet sector. At Hohnsfeld, the 254th Engineer Combat Battalion attempted to establish a roadblock using the only heavy equipment immediately available, a bulldozer. Private Garrett, still dazed from the morning's artillery barrage, found himself manning a machine gun position hastily scraped into frozen ground. He'd fired the weapon exactly 3 times in training, always at stationary targets, always with an instructor standing over him, correcting his grip. Now he stared down the road, watching for German armor that intelligence said couldn't possibly be this far west, this quickly. At 1400 hours, the first Panther tanks appeared in the distance. The bulldozer sat across the road like a child's toy blocking a hallway. Garrett's squad opened fire with everything they had: rifles, the machine gun, 2 bazookas somebody had scrounged from a passing infantry unit. The Germans deployed, maneuvered, and swept through the position with professional efficiency. By 1500 hours, the 254th had ceased to exist as a unit. Garrett was running west with 40 other survivors, no longer an engineer, just another soldier trying to stay alive. But at Bütgenbach, something different happened. Company A of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received orders to establish a defensive line along a ridgeline overlooking the approaches to Malmedy. 143 men, assigned a 2.3-mile front that Corps doctrine said required a full regiment, 3,000 men. Lieutenant D'Amato looked at his company commander, Captain William Pergrin, and asked the obvious question: with what? Pergrin's response became legend in engineer circles. With whatever you've got, engineers build things, build a defense. So they did. They positioned their 9 M2 50 caliber machine guns at intervals that violated every spacing regulation in the field manual. They scattered their 27 bazookas to create the illusion of more firepower than they possessed. They laid mines from their stockpiles, 800 anti-tank mines placed not in proper minefields, but in hasty patterns designed to channelize German armor into kill zones. They used their intimate knowledge of the road network to predict exactly where enemy vehicles would have to slow down, bunch up, expose vulnerable side armor. By 1730, Company A had created a defensive position that, on paper, shouldn't have worked. Whether it would actually work was about to be tested. The engineers' advantages were subtle but real. Unlike infantry companies being rushed into unfamiliar positions, the engineers knew this ground intimately. They'd surveyed these roads. They'd calculated gradients and sight lines for bridge construction projects. They understood how the terrain channeled movement because they'd spent months working with that terrain. When Sergeant Frank Rhea positioned a machine gun on the second floor of a stone barn, he wasn't guessing about fields of fire. He'd photographed this exact view while conducting a bridge survey in October. When Corporal James McNulty placed mines on the shoulder of a road curve, he knew from personal experience that heavy vehicles taking that turn had to slow to 15 miles per hour or risk sliding into the ditch. The engineers were fighting on ground they'd studied as engineers. That knowledge was about to become a weapon. 0300 hours, December 17th. The first German reconnaissance probe hit the 291st positions, a squad of infantry feeling for the American line's extent and strength. The Germans moved cautiously through the pre-dawn darkness, expecting, based on intelligence assessments, to find scattered outposts they could easily bypass. Instead, they found interlocking machine gun fire, pre-registered mortar positions, and mines that hadn't been there 2 days ago. The probe withdrew. At 0615, a more serious attack developed. German infantry, supported by assault guns, attempted to break through at what appeared to be a weak point in the line. The weak point was actually an engagement area the engineers had carefully prepared, with mines on both shoulders forcing vehicles into a narrow lane covered by 3 bazooka teams. The lead assault gun hit a mine. The second took a bazooka round through the side armor. The infantry, deprived of armor support, went to ground under machine gun fire. By 0800, the attack had stalled. The engineers, men who 48 hours earlier had been grading roads and maintaining bridges, had just fought off German veterans who'd been doing this since Poland in 1939. But winning individual engagements wasn't the same as surviving what was coming. By mid-morning, December 17th, the scope of the German offensive was becoming clear. This wasn't a raid, this wasn't a limited attack. This was an army-scale operation driving for the Meuse River and beyond. Engineer units across the front faced an impossible choice: stand and be overrun, or withdraw and abandon positions that were suddenly critical. At Manderfeld, the 168th Engineer Combat Battalion conducted a fighting withdrawal, blowing bridges behind them, mining roads as they retreated, transforming their retreat into a rolling obstacle course that delayed German advance. At Schönberg, the 81st Engineers established a new defensive line, then another, trading space for time in a withdrawal that looked like defeat but was actually brilliant improvisation. Each battalion commander faced variations of the same question: how long do we hold, and what do we hold with? The answer often came down to individual sergeants making decisions that would affect division-level operations. Sergeant Walter Butler of the 202nd Engineer Combat Battalion found himself in command of a roadblock position after German fire killed his lieutenant. He had 16 men, 2 machine guns, and a radio that might or might not be working. German armor was advancing up the road. Doctrine said engineers in this situation should withdraw before being cut off. Butler looked at the map, realized this road was the only paved route to a critical bridge, and decided to stay. For the next 6 hours, his 16 men held that position using every trick they knew: felled trees across the road, mines hidden under snow, machine guns positioned to create crossfire in a defile, bazookas firing from a barn that gave perfect overhead protection. They knocked out 3 German vehicles. They inflicted casualties on infantry attempting to flank the position. They held until nightfall, then withdrew under cover of darkness, having bought 6 irreplaceable hours. Butler would receive a Silver Star for that action. More importantly, the bridge his roadblock protected remained in American hands long enough to evacuate 2 regiments that would have been trapped otherwise. By nightfall, December the 17th, a pattern was emerging. Engineer units thrown into emergency defensive positions were holding longer than anyone had a right to expect. The reasons were both practical and psychological. Practically, engineers had more heavy weapons than standard infantry companies, more machine guns, more bazookas, more explosives that could be improvised into anti-personnel weapons. They had bulldozers that could create fighting positions in frozen ground faster than men with entrenching tools. They had mine detectors that let them safely navigate areas where they'd laid mines the day before. Psychologically, they were fighting on ground they knew, using skills they had developed for entirely different purposes. There was no mystique about holding a defensive position when you'd spent 3 months studying that exact position while planning a bridge construction project. The engineers weren't being heroic. They were being practical. They were using what they had because they had no choice. But the cost was already mounting. In the first 24 hours, engineer units committed to frontline defense suffered 18% casualties, higher than the infantry average of 12% for the same period. The engineers were casualties of their own usefulness. Because they knew the ground, they were placed in critical positions. Because they could delay the Germans, they were ordered to hold beyond reasonable limits. Because they were spread so thin covering the quiet sector, they absorbed the initial shock of the German offensive in positions designed for much larger forces. Private Billington, the soldier who'd unloaded bridge timber on December 10th, was wounded by shrapnel on December 17th while fighting as a rifleman in a defensive position he'd helped construct. He would survive. 61 members of his battalion would not. They came to build bridges and found themselves holding bridges. The transformation from engineer to infantry had taken less than 5 hours. Learning whether they could survive as infantry would take considerably longer. The question facing American commanders as darkness fell on December 17th was stark. Could engineers continue to function as emergency infantry while maintaining their essential engineering mission? Bridges still needed to be blown to stop German armor. Roads still needed to be cleared to evacuate Allied forces. Minefields still needed to be laid to channelize enemy movements. But those same engineers were now the primary, sometimes only, defenders in critical sectors. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, 1st Army commander, made the decision that would define the engineers' role for the rest of the battle. In a message sent to all engineer units on the evening of December 17th, he acknowledged what was already happening on the ground. Engineers would fight as infantry when necessary, for as long as necessary, with whatever support could be provided. The message legitimized the improvisation. It also guaranteed that combat engineers would remain in the most dangerous positions for the duration. They had 5 hours to become infantry. They would spend the next month proving they could stay infantry while never forgetting they were engineers. The dual identity that had seemed like a bureaucratic oddity in peacetime was becoming the American defensive line's only hope in war. 0815, December 17th. Stavelot, Belgium. Captain Frank Ria of Company C, 51st Engineer Combat Battalion, stood on the stone bridge spanning the Amblève River watching a scene from Nightmare. Belgian refugees streamed across from the east. Old men pushing carts, women carrying children, entire families fleeing with whatever they could carry. Behind them, visible in the distance, smoke rose from burning villages. Ria had specific orders regarding this bridge: prepare it for demolition, hold it open for American forces withdrawing from the east, blow it when German spearheads approached. The orders were clear. The reality was anything but. American stragglers were still crossing, mixed with the civilians. German forces were minutes away, maybe less. And Ria had his hand literally on the detonator, waiting for someone to tell him when the last American had crossed. Nobody was telling him anything because nobody knew. This moment, this terrible calculus of who gets to cross and who doesn't, repeated across a dozen rivers and 36 bridges, would determine whether the German offensive reached the Meuse or died in the Ardennes forests. The bridge demolition mission had seemed straightforward when planned during quiet autumn months. Combat engineers maintained explosives pre-positioned at critical bridges. When ordered, they would emplace charges, wire detonators, and execute on command. Standard procedure, practiced in training, covered in field manuals down to the pound of TNT required per foot of span. What the manuals didn't cover was blowing bridges while friendly forces were still trying to use them, or making demolition decisions when communication lines were cut and higher headquarters couldn't be reached, or dealing with Belgian civilians who didn't understand why Americans were destroying their infrastructure. The theoretical demolition mission was colliding with the reality that bridges served multiple purposes simultaneously, and destroying them created as many problems as it solved. 11:45, December 17th, Trois Ponts. Captain James Gamble faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 bridges converged at this small Belgian town, one across the Amblève, one across the Somme, one across the Lienne Creek. Together, they formed the critical junction on the most direct route from German positions to the Meuse River. Gamble's company had prepared all 3 for demolition weeks earlier. Now, intelligence reported German armor advancing fast toward Trois Ponts. American units were still scattered in the area. Some might be trying to reach these bridges. Gamble had mines, explosives, and a clear understanding of what needed to happen. He also had fragmentary information, contradictory orders, and the knowledge that if he guessed wrong, people would die. At 1300 hours, he made his decision. Blow the bridges, all 3, now. The explosives were already in place. 250 pounds of TNT on the Amblev Bridge, 400 pounds on the Salm Bridge, 600 pounds on the Lien Bridge. The charges had been positioned over 45 days of careful preparation, each one calculated to drop the span without excessive damage to the abutments. Gamble gave the order. The detonator plungers went down. The world disappeared in thunder. 1347 hours. The three bridges at Trois Ponts ceased to exist in 90 seconds of coordinated destruction. Stone, steel, and concrete collapsed into rivers that had been spanned since medieval times. The demolitions were textbook perfect. Spans dropped cleanly, abutments intact for eventual rebuilding. No premature detonations or failures. From an engineering perspective, it was beautiful work. From a strategic perspective, it was a catastrophe for German operations. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of 6th Panzer Army, was racing toward Trois Ponts on a timetable that required crossing those bridges by 1400 hours. Instead, Peiper's lead tanks arrived to find smoking rubble and rivers too deep to ford. The most powerful armored force in the German offensive had just hit a wall of missing bridges. Peiper would spend the next 6 hours trying to find alternate routes. Those 6 hours were golden. They bought time for Allied forces to establish defensive lines further west. They allowed evacuation of supplies that would otherwise have been captured. They demonstrated that a combat engineer captain, making a snap decision in a Belgian town, could derail an army's offensive timetable. But bridge demolitions created their own problems. At Haughton, 6 miles west of Trois Ponts, Lieutenant Charles Mitchell received contradicting orders on December 18th that illustrated the chaos. Message 1 from Corps Headquarters: hold bridge open for friendly forces withdrawing from east. Message 2 from Division Headquarters: deny bridge to enemy at all costs. Message 3 from a frantic tank destroyer battalion: we need that bridge to escape encirclement. Mitchell had no way to reconcile these orders because the headquarters issuing them didn't know about each other's messages. Communication lines were cut. Radio traffic was jammed with higher priority messages. Mitchell was on his own with a critical decision and no clear guidance. He chose to hold the bridge open until he had visual contact with German forces, then blow it regardless of who else might be trying to cross. The decision was brutal. It was also probably correct. Mitchell's bridge went down at 0630 December 18th, with German infantry 400 yards away. 3 American vehicles were trapped on the wrong side. Mitchell's after-action report noted this fact without emotion or excuse. War demanded choices. Engineers made them. The statistics of bridge demolition during the Battle of the Bulge reveal the scope of the engineer mission. In the first 48 hours of the German offensive, combat engineer units executed 47 major bridge demolitions across the Ardennes front. Each required between 45 and 120 minutes of preparation time under normal circumstances. During the battle, engineers prepared and blew bridges in as little as 15 minutes, improvising techniques, bypassing safety procedures, accepting risks that peacetime engineering would never tolerate. The average demolition consumed between 250 and 600 pounds of TNT, precisely placed to drop spans without creating obstacles that would impede future Allied use. In 34% of cases, engineers executed demolitions without confirmed orders because cut telephone lines prevented communication with higher headquarters. Battalion and company commanders made strategic decisions based on their assessment of local situations, trusting that their superiors would support them afterward. Usually that trust was warranted. Sometimes it wasn't. The psychological burden of bridge demolition fell hardest on engineers who'd built the structures they now destroyed. At Stir, Captain Robert Conlin led the demolition of a Bailey bridge his company had constructed in October. He knew every bolt and panel of that bridge. He'd supervised its installation over 3 days, solving problems as they emerged, finally seeing it completed and functioning. The bridge had carried thousands of tons of American supplies east toward Germany. Now, Conlin was wiring it with explosives, calculating the charges needed to collapse his own handiwork. The demolition went perfectly. The bridge dropped into the river in one clean collapse. Conlin wrote in his diary that night, "We build them knowing we might have to destroy them. Doesn't make it easier. The entry captured something essential about the combat engineer's identity: the strange duality of construction and destruction, of building and unbuilding, of being simultaneously creator and destroyer. December 18th, afternoon. The cumulative impact of engineer bridge demolitions was becoming clear at German headquarters. Intelligence officers examining maps marked with destroyed bridges realized that every primary route to the Meuse had been interdicted. The Americans were using bridges as weapons, removing crossing points faster than German engineers could replace them. Field Marshal Model, commanding Army Group B, issued increasingly frustrated orders demanding his engineer units build emergency bridges across rivers that American engineers had just made uncrossable. The race between construction and destruction had begun, and the Americans had a head start. Every bridge that fell was another delay, another detour, another hour bought for Allied reinforcements to arrive. The engineers weren't stopping the German offensive, they were slowing it. In December 1944, slowing was enough. By December 19th, the pattern was clear. German forces were finding routes forward, but not the routes they had planned. Every demolished bridge forced detours onto secondary roads. Every detour added hours to movement times. Every added hour allowed American forces to establish new defensive positions further west. The elegant German plan, rapid thrust to the Meuse, then north to Antwerp, was degenerating into a grinding advance through increasingly difficult terrain. At the heart of this degradation were the bridge killers, the combat engineers who'd transformed American infrastructure into an obstacle course. They paid for this success. Bridge demolition teams worked under fire, often in exposed positions. 8 demolition teams were overrun and captured. 17 engineers were killed, preparing or executing bridge demolitions. The numbers were small compared to infantry casualties, but each number represented a specialist, a man trained in skills that couldn't be quickly replaced, dying to drop a bridge that might buy an hour or a day, or just enough time to matter. The doctrine that emerged from these early demolitions would reshape American engineering practice. The field manual assumption that bridges would be blown according to carefully coordinated plans evaporated in contact with reality. Instead, engineers developed rules of thumb. Blow early if you have time to prepare charges properly. Blow late if you need to keep the bridge open for withdrawing friendlies. Blow immediately if German forces are in sight. Always err on the side of denying the enemy, even if it means trapping friendly forces. These weren't official rules. They were survival knowledge passed between engineer officers in hurried conferences and after-action discussions. They were the difference between theoretical demolition operations and actual bridge warfare. And they worked. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were removing crossing points faster than German engineers could replace them. The bridge killers were winning. The price was measured in destroyed infrastructure, trapped vehicles, and the weight of decisions that had to be made in seconds but would be remembered for lifetimes. Captain Gamble, who blew the Trois Ponts bridges on December 17th, would spend decades wondering if he'd made the right call. The answer, clear in hindsight, was that he'd made the only call that mattered. The bridges fell, Piper's offensive stalled, the Meuse remained in American hands. Sometimes destroying what you've built is the only way to save what you're fighting for. December 18th, 1944, Dom Bütgenbach, Belgium. Staff Sergeant Harry Katz of the 202nd Engineer Combat Battalion crouched in frozen mud with a surveying instrument, doing mathematics that would determine whether men lived or died. He was calculating angles of fire, measuring distances in meters, converting terrain geometry into overlapping kill zones. Katz had been a high school mathematics teacher in Brooklyn before the war. Now he was using trigonometry to position machine guns, so their fire would intersect at precisely the points where German tanks would be forced to slow for a curve in the road. The roadblock his platoon was establishing looked simple: felled trees, some mines, a few prepared firing positions. The mathematics behind it were anything but simple. Katz understood something that many infantry officers didn't. Terrain itself could be a weapon if you understood its geometry. Combat engineers approached defensive positions differently than infantry because they saw terrain through different eyes. Infantry looked at ground and saw cover, concealment, fields of fire, tactical features. Engineers looked at the same ground and saw load-bearing capacity, drainage patterns, choke points dictated by geometry. When an engineer examined a road, he didn't just see a route, he saw slope percentages, curve radii, shoulder stability, culvert locations, all the technical details that determine how vehicles could move. This knowledge became lethal when applied to defensive planning. Engineers knew exactly where heavy armor would have to slow down. They knew which roads could support tank traffic and which couldn't. They knew where bridges had weight limits that would force Germans to dismount infantry from vehicles. Every piece of technical knowledge became tactical advantage. The standard engineer roadblock followed a formula developed through trial and error in the first days of the offensive. One felled tree positioned to block the road without being easily pushed aside. 3 anti-tank mines placed in a pattern that forced vehicles attempting to bypass the tree into predictable lanes. 1 bazooka team positioned to hit side armor of vehicles stopped or slowing for the obstacle. 1 machine gun covering the likely dismount points where German infantry would leave their vehicles. Total time to establish, 30 to 45 minutes with a skilled crew. Total delay caused, 15 to 30 minutes if Germans simply cleared the obstacle, 2 to 3 hours if they had to fight through defending forces. The mathematics were clear. 20 men with basic engineer equipment could delay 200 Germans for significant time by exploiting terrain geometry. But Company A of the 291st Engineers at Bütgenbach went far beyond basic roadblocks. They'd been surveying this area for months. They knew it better than the Belgians who lived there. When Lieutenant D'Amato positioned his defenses, he used detailed knowledge accumulated through engineering work. He knew that the road from Billingen had a 6% grade that would slow tanks to 12 miles per hour. He knew the curve at the town entrance had a 30-meter radius that restricted visibility for approaching vehicles. He knew the stone buildings along the road were thick enough to provide overhead protection from tank fire. He turned this knowledge into a defensive system that multiplied his company's combat power. Machine guns positioned on second floors with precisely calculated interlocking fire. Bazookas placed to engage armor at the exact points where terrain forced vehicles to slow. Mines laid not in regular patterns, but in irregular clusters that forced careful clearance. The result was fortress built from geometry. December 19th. A German reconnaissance element approached Bütgenbach, expecting to find scattered resistance they could easily push aside. Instead, they encountered a defensive position that seemed to anticipate their every move. Vehicles slowing for the curve took fire from multiple positions simultaneously. Infantry attempting to flank the roadblock triggered mines that engineers had placed specifically to cover likely flanking routes. Attempts to suppress American positions with tank fire were frustrated by overhead protection and fields of fire that prevented Germans from establishing firing positions. The reconnaissance withdrew after losing 2 vehicles and achieving nothing. The defenders were clearly engineers, prisoners-identified units, but they were fighting with sophistication that suggested extensive planning and preparation. The Germans didn't realize they were fighting men who'd spent 3 months studying this exact terrain for entirely different purposes. The force multiplication achieved through terrain knowledge was quantifiable. A standard infantry company of 200 men occupying prepared positions could typically delay an equal-sized German force for 2 to 4 hours. Engineer units using terrain expertise achieved similar delays with forces 1/10 the size. The 291st Company A, 143 men, held a front designed for 3,000 men, not through superior firepower, but through superior positioning. They placed their limited weapons exactly where terrain multiplied their effectiveness. They created obstacles exactly where geography made obstacles most difficult to bypass. They fought from positions they'd selected based on engineering surveys that told them sight lines, ranges, and fields of fire with precision impossible for units just moving into the area. The innovation that emerged was the daisy chain mine technique, developed by engineers who understood explosives better than infantry mine warfare specialists. Standard doctrine called for anti-tank mines to be buried individually, each requiring a tank to drive directly over it for detonation. Engineers modified this by linking multiple mines with detonation cord, so that one mine triggering would set off an entire string simultaneously. A tank crossing a daisy-chained minefield would detonate 8 to 12 mines at once, producing blast effects that could catastrophically destroy even heavy armor. The technique was theoretically against regulations. It made mine clearance more difficult for later Allied use, but it was devastatingly effective. German after-action reports from the Bütgenbach sector reported tanks blown completely apart by mine detonations that seemed impossibly powerful. They were encountering American engineering ingenuity applied to mine warfare. The obstacles themselves evolved beyond simple barriers to become integrated systems. Engineers combined trees felled across roads with craters blown in the roadbed, forcing vehicles to slow to a crawl. They booby-trapped obstacles, so German engineers attempting removal would trigger explosives. They positioned obstacles specifically to channelize German movement into prepared kill zones, rather than simply blocking movement entirely. The goal wasn't to stop German advance completely. That was impossible with available forces, but to force Germans into predictable patterns where limited American firepower could be applied most effectively. Every meter of road became a calculated problem in military geometry. Staff Sergeant Katz, the former math teacher, kept detailed notes on obstacle effectiveness. His observations became the basis for new engineer doctrine. One properly positioned obstacle, he wrote, causes 15 to 20 minutes delay. Obstacle plus covering fire causes 2 to 3 hour delay. Obstacle plus covering fire plus mines causes German force to call forward engineers, artillery, infantry support. Minimum 4-hour delay, and often decision to find alternate route entirely. Katz was quantifying what engineers had discovered through practice. Obstacles weren't just physical barriers, but psychological ones. Each obstacle German forces encountered suggested more obstacles ahead. Each suggested a prepared, organized defense rather than scattered resistance. The cumulative psychological effect often exceeded the physical impediment. December 21st. By now, German commanders were learning to recognize engineer-defended sectors, the systematic obstacle placement, the precision of defensive positions, the integration of mines with other obstacles. These were signatures of engineer units. Some German commanders began probing for sectors defended by regular infantry instead, calculating that engineer-held positions were more difficult to crack than their thin manning suggested. This was perhaps the ultimate validation of engineer defensive techniques. The Germans, facing limited time and resources, were choosing to avoid engineer positions when possible. 20-man engineer roadblocks were shaping divisional-level German movements. The roadblock mathematics worked. One engineer with proper tools, knowledge, and positioning equaled 5 to 10 infantry in defensive value. Multiply that across company and battalion-level operations, and combat engineers were punching far above their weight class. They weren't winning through superior firepower. They were winning through superior understanding of the relationship between terrain, geometry, and violence. They were turning the landscape itself into a weapon, and the Germans were learning to respect the equation. 1400 hours, December the 17th. La Glaise, Belgium. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper stood in the cupola of his command tank, watching smoke rise from where a bridge should have been. His Kampfgruppe, 4,000 men, 600 vehicles, spearhead of the entire 6th Panzer Army offensive, had just been stopped by absent infrastructure. The bridge across the Amblève at Trois Ponts had collapsed 30 minutes before his arrival. Petonators fired by American engineers had dropped the span cleanly, leaving nothing but rubble and fast-moving water. Piper's timetable called for crossing the Meuse River in 48 hours. He had already lost 6 hours to poor roads and American resistance. Now, he was losing more hours to missing bridges. He ordered his column to backtrack 8 kilometers to find an alternate crossing. The delays were mounting. Time, Piper's most precious resource, was bleeding away. The plan for Kampfgruppe Peiper had been elegant in its simplicity. Punch through American lines in the first hours, drive west on good roads at maximum speed, cross the Meuse before Allied reinforcements could react, then turn north toward Antwerp. Speed was everything. Hitler had personally emphasized this to the commanders. Move fast, don't stop to reduce resistance. Leave infantry to clean up bypass positions. Your mission is the Meuse River and beyond. Peiper had nodded. Understanding that his entire operation depended on maintaining momentum, 48 hours to the Meuse, 96 hours to Antwerp. Timetables measured in hours, not days. Every delay compounded. Every missing bridge multiplied previous delays. And now, American engineers were systematically removing the bridges Piper needed. December 18th, morning. Stoumont. Piper's column found itself on a secondary road never designed for 60-ton King Tiger tanks. The primary route, blocked by demolished bridges, had forced this detour onto tracks that wound through forest, where passing was impossible and turning around nearly so. American artillery began falling with suspicious accuracy, as if observers knew exactly where German armor would be forced to go. Piper didn't realize he was fighting American engineers who'd surveyed these roads months earlier and understood precisely where his column would be most vulnerable. The engineers had created a trap using geography and removed infrastructure. Piper was driving into it because he had no choice. Every other route was blocked or worse. By December 19th, the situation was becoming desperate. Piper's fuel trucks were burning through their loads faster than planned because the detours added kilometers to every movement. His vehicles were breaking down on roads too narrow and poorly maintained for sustained armor operations. And everywhere his reconnaissance probed for alternate routes, they found bridges missing. At Cheneux, engineers blew a bridge while under direct fire from Piper's lead elements, dropping the span with German tanks 400 meters away. The demolition was executed perfectly despite incoming fire. Piper's column was forced into another detour, this one onto tracks that his maps showed as unpaved farm roads. The mighty spearhead was being reduced to careful progress through increasingly constricted terrain. The cumulative effect of engineer demolitions on Piper's operation was precisely calculable. Original route from start line to Meuse, 35 kilometers on primary roads. Estimated travel time, 48 hours, including anticipated combat delays. Actual route forced by demolished bridges. 68 kilometers on mixture of primary and secondary roads. Actual travel time, 173 hours. 7 days versus 2. 11 separate bridge demolitions had forced Piper onto progressively worse routes. 23 major roadblocks had added delay upon delay. The result was geometric multiplication of problems. Each obstacle didn't just cause its own delay, but forced detours that created new delays. Engineers hadn't destroyed Piper's Kampfgruppe through direct combat. They'd destroyed it through systematic removal of infrastructure. December 21st. Piper's reconnaissance reported the situation in terms that must have been bitter to deliver. All routes to Meuse blocked by demolished bridges, alternate routes under American observation and artillery fire, fuel status critical, ammunition expenditure exceeding resupply capacity, position untenable for sustained operations. Piper faced the mathematics of his situation. He could continue forward and certainly be destroyed piecemeal. He could retreat and admit failure, or he could hold position and hope for relief that wasn't coming. He chose to hold, concentrating his remaining strength in L'Église and preparing for encirclement. The spearhead had become an island. The 51st, 291st, and 202nd Engineer Combat Battalions had executed a coordinated demolition plan they had never formally coordinated. No single headquarters had ordered the destruction of specific bridges in specific sequence. Instead, company and battalion commanders made independent decisions based on local situations, and those decisions happened to create an interlocking system that closed every route Piper needed. It was accidental genius or brilliant improvisation, depending on perspective. Either way, it worked. The 111th Engineer Group, examining the pattern afterward, realized that 3 engineer battalions operating independently had achieved effects equivalent to corps-level planning. The equipment abandoned by Piper when he finally escaped on foot, December 24th told the story of engineer effectiveness. 39 tanks, including 6 King Tigers, the most powerful armor Germany possessed. 70 half-tracks, all remaining artillery. 203 vehicles of various types. Mountains of ammunition, fuel, supplies. Piper marched out at night with the 800 men who could still walk, leaving behind a mechanized Kampfgruppe's worth of equipment sitting intact but useless in a Belgian village. The Germans destroyed what they could, but lacked time and demolitions to properly deny all the material. American forces advancing into La Gleize found a mechanized treasure trove. More importantly, they found proof that engineers had destroyed Germany's best chance for success. The after-action analysis was damning for German planning and validating for American engineering. Peiper's operation had assumed bridges would be available or could be rapidly replaced by German engineers. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American combat engineers had demolished critical bridges faster than German engineers could repair them. More importantly, American engineers had demolished bridges in sequence that progressively trapped Peiper rather than simply delaying him. The first demolished bridge forced a detour. The second demolished bridge on the detour route forced another detour. The third demolished bridge closed the trap. By the time Peiper realized he was being systematically isolated, he lacked fuel and time to extract himself. The human cost on the American side was significant but asymmetric. 17 engineers died in bridge demolition operations that stopped Peiper. Compare that to the hundreds of German casualties and thousands of prisoners Peiper's Kampfgruppe would have inflicted had they reached their objectives. The force multiplication was extraordinary. Each engineer casualty in bridge operations prevented dozens or hundreds of Allied casualties elsewhere. The mathematics were brutal but clear. Destroying infrastructure costs less than defending against the forces that infrastructure would have enabled. Combat engineers had proven that construction expertise converted to destruction expertise with lethal efficiency. They built bridges understanding how bridges failed. When they wired those bridges for demolition, they knew exactly where to place charges for maximum effect. Peiper encountered engineering precision, translated into military effectiveness. December 24. As Peiper's survivors stumbled east through American lines in small groups, abandoning everything they'd fought to gain, the strategic implications were becoming clear at higher headquarters. The northern shoulder of the German offensive had failed, not stopped by counterattack, not defeated in tank battle, failed because it couldn't move fast enough, couldn't cross rivers where bridges were missing, couldn't maintain momentum when every road was blocked or booby-trapped or too narrow for armor. Field Marshal Montgomery, assuming command of American forces north of the Bulge, examined the situation and noted in his diary, "Engineers have won this on the northern flank. Infantry held positions, but engineers removed the Germans' ability to exploit even where defenses cracked. Quite extraordinary." It was rare praise from Montgomery. It was also accurate. The bridge killers and roadblock builders had done more than fight well. They'd fundamentally altered the terrain itself, transforming Belgium from highway to maze, removing the infrastructure modern warfare required. Peiper had driven Germany's finest armor into a trap built from missing bridges and roadblock mathematics. He would never admit that engineers defeated him, but they had. Systematically, deliberately, and with engineer precision. December 17th, nightfall. Corporal James Lynch of the 296th Engineer Combat Battalion worked by flashlight in frozen ground, his hands numb, despite gloves, planting anti-tank mines in a pattern that violated every regulation he'd been taught. Proper doctrine required mines buried 15 centimeters deep, carefully mapped, marked with warning signs, installed over days of methodical preparation. Lynch was burying mines 5 centimeters deep because the ground was frozen harder, installing them in darkness without maps, because there was no time for maps, and skipping warning signs because the Germans were coming and needed to find these mines the hard way. Around him, 8 other engineers worked in similar haste, planting death in Belgian soil at a pace that would have horrified peacetime instructors. They had perhaps 4 hours before German reconnaissance reached this road. They needed to lay 300 mines. The mathematics left no time for doctrine. Mine warfare was supposed to be deliberate, controlled, scientific. Engineers trained for months on proper minefield installation, survey the ground, mark safe lanes, plot each mine's location on overlay maps, install mines at regulation depth and spacing, mark the field with warning signs, record everything for eventual removal. A proper defensive minefield took 3 to 4 days to install correctly. The Bulge gave engineers 3 to 4 hours. Everything changed. Mine warfare became improvisation warfare. Engineers developed new techniques born from desperation and refined through necessity. Nuisance minefields emerged, small, irregular patterns designed not to stop German advance completely, but to slow it, disrupt it, create uncertainty. Standard minefields had predictable patterns that could be breached with standard techniques. Nuisance minefields had no patterns. They were chaos rendered in buried explosives. The scale of mine deployment in the first 10 days of the offensive was staggering. 75,000 anti-tank mines, 50,000 anti-personnel mines, 125,000 individual explosive devices buried across the Ardennes in hasty installations that often lacked proper documentation. Engineers pulled mines from supply dumps that had accumulated during the quiet autumn months, loaded them onto trucks, drove to threatened sectors, and planted them wherever seemed useful. Some minefields were concentrated barriers. Others were scattered hazards. All were dangerous, to Germans, to Americans, to Belgian civilians who would be living with these buried threats for decades. December 19th, 0430. A German infantry probe advancing toward Bütgenbach triggered a section of minefield that the 291st Engineers had installed the previous evening. The first mine detonated under a vehicle, destroying it and blocking the road. Infantry dismounting to clear the obstacle triggered anti-personnel mines. Engineers had mixed mine types, anti-tank and anti-personnel, in patterns designed to maximize casualties during clearance operations. The German probe withdrew with 15 casualties, having advanced perhaps 200 meters. The minefield had performed exactly as intended. It hadn't stopped the Germans. It had made them cautious, careful, slow. Those were the objectives: slow the enemy, create uncertainty, force elaborate clearance procedures that consume time and resources. The technical challenge of mine, laying in frozen ground, forced innovation. Standard anti-tank mines required burial because surface-laid mines were too visible and too easily cleared. But 15 centimeters of frozen earth defeated entrenching tools and even picks. Engineers developed workarounds. Thermite charges to thaw small patches of ground. Chemical earth warmers that generated heat to soften soil. In extreme cases, simply surface-laying mines and camouflaging them with snow. This last technique was dangerous. Snow depth varied, and a mine visible today might be obvious tomorrow, or invisible next week. But engineers were making battlefield calculations where perfect became the enemy of good enough. Visible mines were better than no mines. Poorly documented minefields were better than unmarked avenues for German armor. December 22nd. Sergeant William Wiedefeld examined a destroyed Panther tank, counting the damage. 14 separate mine detonations. The tank had hit a daisy-chained minefield, where engineers had linked multiple mines with detonation cord. The first mine triggered the chain. All 14 exploded simultaneously. The Panther's underside armor, designed to withstand single mine blasts, couldn't handle overlapping explosions. The tank was catastrophically destroyed, turret blown off, hull cracked open, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. Wiedefeld took photographs for an after-action report, documenting the effectiveness of a technique that field manuals didn't authorize but combat experience validated. The images would circulate through engineer units, spreading knowledge of what worked. The German casualty figures from mine warfare were difficult to quantify, precisely but clearly significant. Post-battle analysis estimated 12 to 18% of German armor losses in the Ardennes were attributable to mines, triple the typical 3 to 5% in other campaigns. Engineer minefields were having disproportionate effect because they combined quantity with unpredictability. German mine clearance doctrine assumed logical minefield patterns. American emergency minefields had no logic except put mines where Germans might drive. This created clearance problems that consumed German engineer resources. Every suspected minefield required careful probing. Every cleared lane might have additional mines in unexpected positions. The Germans were fighting an enemy that had weaponized disorder. But the hasty mine deployment created problems for American forces as well. By late December, as Allied preparations for counteroffensive began, staff officers realized that large sections of the Ardennes were mined with incomplete or non-existent documentation. The 202nd Engineers had laid 4,000 mines in 3 days, but mapped perhaps 30% of them. The 296th Engineers had installed mines at night in areas they couldn't properly survey. Multiple units had laid mines in overlapping sectors without coordinating with each other. The result was Belgian countryside seeded with American explosives that American forces couldn't completely locate. This would complicate counteroffensive operations and create long-term hazards for civilians. Private First Class Donald Jakeway, a mine warfare specialist with the 159th Engineers, tried to maintain proper documentation even during emergency installations. He carried a notebook where he sketched approximate mine locations, recording landmarks and pacing distances. When time permitted, he took compass bearings. Most engineers weren't this careful. Jakeway's notes, turned over to clearance teams in January, helped remove thousands of mines. But even his careful documentation was incomplete. "We laid mines in darkness," he wrote in his diary, "in places I'd never seen in daylight, at speeds that made precision impossible. I recorded what I could. God help whoever has to clear what I couldn't record." His words captured the ethical dilemma of emergency mine warfare. You were protecting American soldiers now, while creating hazards for unknown people later. The innovation that emerged from Bulge mine warfare would reshape American doctrine permanently. Pre-war training emphasized careful, documented minefield installation. Post-Bulge training emphasized rapid emergency installation with whatever documentation was possible. The good enough approach to mine warfare, better to have undocumented mines delaying the enemy than well-documented mines that arrive too late, became accepted practice. Engineers developed new techniques for rapid installation, quick camouflage, abbreviated mapping. The careful science of minefield installation gave way to the brutal practicality of emergency obstacle creation. It worked. German forces advancing through the Ardennes encountered mines everywhere, in patterns that defied prediction, slowing advance and creating casualties. The buried thunder that combat engineers planted in December 1944 was still being discovered decades later, rusted, dangerous, a permanent reminder of a month when American engineers turned Belgian soil into a weapon and worried about consequences later. The mines worked. That was what mattered in December. The complications would last much longer. December 18th, 0300 hours. The Our River, Germany-Belgium border. Hauptmann Friedrich Brandt commanded 1st Company, 62nd Volksgrenadier Division. Engineer Battalion, and faced a problem American engineers had solved 2 days earlier: how to bridge a river under fire. Except the Americans had blown bridges. Brandt needed to build them. His company possessed standard German engineer bridging equipment: timber, steel beams, pontoons, cables. What they didn't possess was time, security, or American cooperation. Brandt's infantry needed this crossing to maintain offensive momentum. He had perhaps 12 hours of darkness to construct a bridge that normally required 2 days, and American artillery observers were certainly watching this river bend, waiting for German engineers to expose themselves. The Battle of the Bulge was fundamentally an engineering duel, American engineers removing crossings versus German engineers replacing them. 15 separate German engineer battalions had been committed to the Ardennes offensive, each including specialized bridge-building companies. Their mission was straightforward: restore crossing capability wherever American demolitions had removed it, execute rapidly under combat conditions, enabling German armor and infantry to maintain momentum. The mission was straightforward. The execution was nearly impossible. Bridge construction required concentration of men and equipment in predictable locations for extended periods. Those characteristics made bridge sites perfect artillery targets. Brandt began his bridge construction at 0330 after reconnaissance confirmed the site and engineers pre-positioned materials. 60 men working in rotating shifts. Timber cribbing driven into the riverbed to create footings. Beams positioned across the cribs to form decking. All of this in darkness, in near freezing water, while trying to maintain noise discipline that would prevent American observers from detecting activity. Standard doctrine called for floodlights to illuminate work areas. Brant worked by moonlight and shaded lanterns, knowing that any visible light would bring artillery. By 0600, his men had constructed perhaps 1/3 of the necessary span. Progress was slower than planned. Dawn was approaching, and American artillery was about to make his night much worse. 0645. The first American artillery rounds impacted 200 meters from Brant's bridge site, ranging shots. Someone had spotted the construction. Brant had perhaps 3 minutes before fire for effect would arrive. He ordered his men to take cover, abandoning the partially constructed bridge. At 0648, a battalion-level artillery strike obliterated 12 hours of work in 3 minutes of high explosive and white phosphorus. Timber splintered, steel beams twisted, pontoons punctured and sank. The engineers who'd spent all night building watched from cover as American gunners destroyed their work with casual efficiency. When the barrage lifted, Brant assessed the damage. Total loss. They would need to start over, at a different location, with depleted materials and exhausted men. The pattern repeated across the Ardennes, wherever German engineers attempted bridge construction. At the Somme River, Wehrmacht engineers worked for 18 hours constructing a pontoon bridge only to have American aircraft destroy it at dawn. At the the river, engineers completed a bridge under darkness, saw the first German tanks cross at sunrise, then watched American artillery drop the span, with the third tank halfway across. The mathematics were brutal. Bridge construction under unopposed conditions, 8 to 12 hours. Bridge construction under fire, 36 to 48 hours, if successful at all. Bridge survival time after completion, measured in hours or even minutes, if American observers maintained watch. The 159th Engineer Combat Battalion had received a specialized mission: destroy German bridging attempts. Captain Robert Conlin, the same officer who demolished his own bridge at Star, now commanded a platoon dedicated to counter-bridging operations. His men observed German-held river crossings, identified construction attempts, and called artillery or airstrikes to destroy them. Conlin maintained detailed logs of German bridging efforts. December 18th, Our River, 4 kilometers south of Dasburg. German engineers observed beginning construction 0400 hours. Artillery strike executed 0715. Bridge destroyed. December 19th, same location. Second bridging attempt observed. Artillery strike 0. 9:30. Bridge destroyed. December 20th, location abandoned by Germans. The logs documented systematic frustration of German engineering. By December 23rd, German engineer casualties were mounting catastrophically. The 62nd Volksgrenadier Engineer Battalion had started the offensive with full strength, 612 men. After 5 days of bridging attempts under fire, effective strength was 240 men, 60% casualties. Other German engineer units reported similar losses. Bridge construction attracted concentrated American fire. Engineers working in rivers couldn't take cover quickly. The work required concentration of forces in small areas. Everything about bridge construction made engineers vulnerable. The Germans were losing their engineering capacity faster than they were losing infantry. The few successful German bridge constructions demonstrated what was possible with exceptional luck and skill. At Dasburg, German engineers completed a bridge in one night of furious work, positioned it in a location American observers couldn't see, and managed to pass an entire division across before American intelligence identified the crossing. The success was an outlier. For every bridge the Germans completed, they failed at 4 or 5 others. The success rate, approximately 26% of attempted major river crossings successfully completed, was catastrophic for offensive operations that depended on maintaining multiple routes forward. The comparison between American and German engineer performance in river crossing operations revealed fundamental differences in capability and doctrine. American engineers had months of reconnaissance and preparation before the battle. They knew every bridge, every crossing site, every approach route. When they demolished bridges, they were destroying infrastructure they had maintained and studied. German engineers were working in unfamiliar territory, often without adequate maps, attempting construction in locations they had never reconnoitered. American engineers worked with air superiority and artillery support that could protect demolition operations. German engineers worked under American air superiority and artillery that targeted every construction attempt. The asymmetry was overwhelming. December 26th. Hauptmann Brandt sat in a farmhouse writing a report that was really a plea. Bridge construction under current conditions is not tactically feasible, he wrote to division headquarters. American artillery observes all river crossings. American aircraft destroys bridges in daylight. Engineer casualties exceed 50%. Material losses prevent sustained operations. Request infantry secure crossing sites before engineer commitment, or accept bridges cannot be built. The response came back within hours. Build bridges. Offensive depends on crossing capability. Casualties secondary to mission requirements. Brandt crumpled the message. His men were dying to build bridges that lasted minutes. The offensive was failing not because German infantry couldn't fight, but because German engineers couldn't build fast enough under fire. The Americans had turned river crossing from tactical problem into strategic impossibility. Combat engineers on both sides understood what was happening. The Americans were winning the engineering war. That meant they were winning the war that mattered. Tanks could fight brilliantly, infantry could advance courageously, but without bridges to cross rivers, the offensive would strangle on demolished infrastructure and rivers that had become moats. The bridge builders versus the bridge killers, and the killers were winning. December the 17th, 1400 hours. Malmedy, Belgium. Lieutenant Aloysius D'Amato stood at a crossroads watching medics load bodies onto trucks. Battery B, 285th Field, Artillery Observation Battalion. 84 men murdered in a field 1 mile south of town, gunned down after surrendering to Kampfgruppe, Piper's lead elements. Some shot while standing with hands raised, others murdered while lying wounded. The massacre had occurred 3 hours earlier. News was spreading through American lines with the speed that only atrocity travels. D'Amato's Company A had worked alongside Battery B for weeks, sharing billets, trading cigarettes, helping each other with routine tasks that made army life bearable. Now those men were corpses being photographed for war crimes, evidence. The Malmedy massacre changed everything for the two 91st Engineers defending the town. This was no longer about holding a tactical position or delaying German advance or following orders from higher headquarters. This was personal. The Germans who'd murdered American prisoners were part of Piper's Kampfgruppe, currently advancing toward Malmedy from multiple directions. The engineers understood with brutal clarity that surrender was not an option, that German forces approaching their positions included men who'd proven they would murder prisoners. Captain William Pergrin, commanding Company A, called his platoon leaders together that evening. "You've heard what happened," he said without preamble. "Piper's column did this. They're coming for Malmedy. We're going to stop them here, or we're going to die trying. But we are not surrendering to murderers. Clear?" The response was immediate and unanimous. December 18th, dawn. The first German attack hit Malmedy's perimeter with the confidence of forces expecting minimal resistance. German intelligence assessed Malmedy as lightly held by support troops who would withdraw or surrender when pressed. What they encountered instead was a defensive position transformed by rage and determination into something far more formidable than its manning suggested. 143 engineers holding a 2.3-mile perimeter. Every man understood that survival meant winning. Machine gun positions that engineers had established 2 days earlier were now manned by soldiers who'd lost friends to massacre. Every German in those sites represented the men who'd murdered Battery B. The defensive advantages engineers possessed became magnified by motivation and familiarity. These men knew Malmedy better than the town's residents. They'd surveyed every building for billeting suitability. They'd examined every street for traffic flow capacity. They'd identified every basement, every stone wall, every covered position during months of routine work. Now that knowledge became tactical advantage. Engineers positioned in second-floor rooms had calculated exact ranges to likely German approach routes. Bazooka teams occupied positions selected for overhead protection and side-angle shots at armor. Machine guns covered interlocking fire zones mapped with engineer precision. The town itself had been transformed into a fortress through application of engineering knowledge to defensive warfare. The innovation that emerged was weaponization of engineering explosives for defensive combat. Company A had access to substantial quantities of TNT and other demolitions intended for bridge destruction. Facing German infantry attacks, engineers rigged buildings with demolition charges, 500 pounds of high explosive wired to command detonation. When German forces attempted to advance through a specific street, engineers detonated charges that collapsed buildings, creating instant obstacles while inflicting casualties. When Germans tried to establish positions in stone structures at the perimeter edge, engineers blew those structures with precision that came from months of calculating demolition charges. The town became a battlefield where buildings themselves were weapons, rigged and ready to explode under engineer control. December 21st, 3 days into the siege, German forces had made multiple determined attacks, probing for weakness, trying to find a sector where engineer defenses could be cracked. Each attack encountered resistance that seemed disproportionate to defending force size. German after-action reports expressed confusion about Malmö's garrison strength. Defending forces estimated at battalion strength minimum, one report stated, based on volume and coordination of defensive fire. The actual defending force was less than company strength. The Germans were encountering force multiplication through expertise, motivation, and engineering applied to infantry combat. The close-quarters fighting tested engineers in ways their training had never anticipated. December 23rd brought German infantry into Malmö's streets in strength. House-to-house combat developed in sectors where German forces penetrated the perimeter. Engineers fought with rifles, then with rifle butts when ammunition ran short, then with entrenching tools and bayonets in hand-to-hand combat that reduced warfare to its most primitive level. Corporal James McNulty, who'd spent 6 months operating a bulldozer, killed 3 German soldiers in a cellar fight using his shovel as a weapon. The tools of construction became instruments of survival. The men who'd built things were learning they could destroy men with the same tools and the same determination. The casualty rate was staggering, but the position held. 41% of defending engineers were killed or wounded by December 26th when relief forces finally broke through. 61 men dead or wounded from 143 engaged. In any normal calculation, such casualties would mean unit destruction and position loss. Company A never yielded an inch of their original defensive line. Every German attack was thrown back. Every penetration was sealed. Every position held. The mathematics of combat suggested this was impossible. The reality was that impossibility had become irrelevant. These were engineers who'd watched friends murdered. They fought with the desperation of men who knew surrender meant death, and the skill of men who understood the terrain intimately. December 26th. First Army units advancing to relieve Malmedy expected to find ruins defended by exhausted survivors barely holding on. Instead, they found an organized defensive perimeter, engineers still occupying fighting positions with tactical discipline, obstacles and minefields still intact and mapped. Captain Pergrin reported to the relieving force commander with the formality of an officer whose unit had accomplished its mission. Company A 291st Engineer Combat Battalion reports Malmedy perimeter secure, all assigned positions held, ready for further orders. The relieving commander looked at the exhausted engineers, at the casualties being evacuated, at the defensive works that had held against everything the Germans threw at them. "What's your unit strength?" he asked. Pergrin's response was matter of fact. 82 effectives remaining from 143 committed. Mission accomplished. The Malmedy stand became legend within engineer circles, though it never received the broader recognition that Bastogne achieved. The paratroopers at Bastogne were surrounded, outnumbered, and held until relieved, a story that captured public imagination. The engineers at Malmedy were never surrounded, only threatened, fighting from positions they'd prepared themselves, using skills nobody associated with heroic infantry defense. The difference in recognition reflected broader patterns. Society understood infantry heroism. Society didn't understand engineering, converted to combat effectiveness. But the engineers who'd held Malmedy understood what they'd accomplished. They'd proven that training, terrain knowledge, and determination could transform support troops into frontline defenders. They had demonstrated that the dual identity of combat engineers, builder and fighter, was not a weakness, but a strength. They built defensive positions with engineer expertise. They fought from those positions with infantry courage. The combination was lethal to German forces and validating to engineers who'd always wondered which identity mattered more. The answer, written in blood and explosives and 9 days of desperate defense, was both. Combat engineers were both, simultaneously, and that made them dangerous in ways that pure infantry or pure engineering could never achieve. January 3rd, 1945, 2200 hours. Our River, Belgium-Germany border. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser of the 51st Engineer Combat Battalion stood on a riverbank watching his men work in darkness and sub-zero cold. 3 weeks earlier, engineers at this same river had been blowing bridges to stop German advance. Now they were building bridges to enable American counteroffensive. The mission was clear. First Army would attack east beginning January the 5th. Armor needed to cross the Our River in strength. That required a Bailey Bridge. 170 feet of prefabricated steel panels and trusses, rated for 40-ton vehicles, assembled on site under combat conditions. Standard construction time without enemy interference, 12 to 16 hours. Fraser had been given 7 hours to complete the bridge while German artillery periodically shelled the site. Bailey Bridge construction was engineering theater, precise, technical, demanding perfect execution of complex procedures. Each bridge consisted of prefabricated panels 10 feet long and 5 feet high, weighing 570 pounds. The panels locked together with steel pins to form trusses. The trusses were assembled on the riverbank, then launched across the gap using a launching nose, a lightweight extension that cantilevered the growing bridge across the span until it reached the far bank. Every step required coordination between multiple teams. Panel assembly, truss construction, launching, decking installation. One mistake, one misaligned pin, one panel dropped, and the entire operation stopped while engineers corrected the problem. Doing this in darkness, in winter, under artillery fire, seemed almost impossible. Fraser had prepared extensively for this operation, using techniques engineers had developed during 3 weeks of defensive operations. Prefabrication under camouflage was the key innovation. Instead of assembling the bridge at the river where German observers could see activity, Fraser's company pre-assembled major components 1 kilometer behind the front line under camouflage netting. Entire truss sections were built, inspected, and readied for transport. When darkness fell, January 3rd, trucks moved these prefabricated sections to the river in a coordinated operation that delivered bridge components like artillery ammunition, quickly, efficiently, in sequence. The technique cut assembly time at the exposed river site from 12 hours to 7. 2:30, January 4th. German artillery began falling near the bridge site, not a concentrated barrage, but harassing fire, random shells designed to disrupt work and inflict casualties. Engineers continued working through the shelling with discipline that came from weeks under fire. When shells impacted close, men took momentary cover, then resumed work without waiting for all clear signals. The launching proceeded panel by panel, truss by truss, engineers manipulating heavy steel components with the precision of watchmakers despite frozen fingers and incoming artillery. Sergeant William Wiedefeld, supervising the launching crew, maintained a running commentary that combined technical instruction with dark humor. Next panel, careful with that pin, perfect. Now launch another section. Duck, here comes another shell. Okay, launching again. Watch your fingers, they'll freeze to the steel. The mathematics of bridge construction under fire were unforgiving. Each German artillery round that landed close enough to force engineers into cover added 3 to 5 minutes to construction time. Each casualty, and there were casualties, required evacuation and replacement, adding 10 to 15 minutes while new men integrated into work crews. Each equipment problem, each misaligned panel, each dropped component added delay. Fraser watched the clock and the bridge growth with equal intensity, calculating whether his 7-hour deadline was achievable. By 0400, the bridge was 60% complete. By 0500, 80%. The final sections went rapidly as dawn approached. and engineers worked with desperate speed to finish before daylight exposed them to German observation. 0615, January the 4th. The bridge was complete. 170 feet of steel spanning the Our River, capable of carrying the 40-ton Sherman tanks that would lead First Army's counteroffensive. Total construction time, 7 hours 45 minutes, a record for combat conditions, faster than many peacetime constructions. Fraser walked the length of the bridge, inspecting joints and connections with engineer's eye for potential weakness. Everything was solid, everything was ready. At 0630, the first American tanks began crossing, their tracks clanging on the steel decking in a sound that announced the offensive's beginning. Tank crews saluted the engineers as they passed, a gesture of respect from one technical specialty to another. Fraser saluted back, feeling satisfaction that came from impossible mission accomplished. The cost of this accomplishment was measured in casualties that seemed small in absolute terms, but devastating to engineer units already depleted. 23 engineers killed or wounded during bridge construction operations in the first week of January. Each casualty represented specialized training, experience accumulated over months of operations, knowledge that couldn't be quickly replaced. The engineer replacing a bridge construction casualty might know Bailey Bridge theory, but lacked the practical experience of assembling panels under fire, launching trusses while under artillery bombardment, maintaining focus while men died nearby. The casualty rate among combat engineers was quietly becoming unsustainable, though nobody was yet willing to acknowledge this publicly. January 5th afternoon. Fraser's Bridge was carrying 400 vehicles per day. Tanks, tank destroyers, artillery pieces, supply trucks, the mechanical bloodstream of American offensive operations. Engineers maintained constant watch on the structure, monitoring for signs of stress or damage from heavy traffic. They had built the bridge to standard specifications, but standards assumed maintenance and inspection that combat conditions made difficult. Cracks appeared in welds, bolts loosened from vehicle vibration. Each problem required immediate repair while traffic continued flowing. Bridge construction wasn't a one-time mission, but an ongoing maintenance operation that consumed engineer resources continuously. January 6th, Fraser received new orders. Dismantle the Our River Bridge and move it 30 kilometers south where another crossing was needed. The bridge his men had risked their lives to build would be taken apart, transported, and rebuilt elsewhere. Such was the nature of Bailey Bridge operations. The bridges were designed to be reusable, moved from site to site as tactical situations changed. The engineers who'd assembled the bridge in darkness under artillery fire now disassembled it in daylight under small arms harassment, working with the same precision in reverse. By January 7th, the bridge was gone, moved south, ready for reconstruction. The river returned to its unbridged state as if engineers had never been there. The mental transition from destroying bridges to building them was more complex than official accounts acknowledged. These were the same men who 3 weeks earlier had been wiring bridges with demolitions, calculating charge placements, blowing infrastructure with engineer precision. Now they were building infrastructure with equal precision, using the same technical knowledge in reverse. Sergeant Michael Traynor, who'd supervised the Trois Ponts demolition in December, found himself supervising bridge construction in January at nearly the same location. "It felt wrong," he admitted in a letter home. "We blew this bridge to stop the Germans. Now we're rebuilding to chase them. I understand the logic, but my hands remember the demolition. And putting it back seems like apologizing for winning." His words captured the psychological complexity of engineering war, the strange duality of construction and destruction, the requirement to be expert in both, the mental adjustment required to switch between them. But the engineers made the adjustment because that was their mission. They built, they destroyed, they built again. The dual identity that had seemed like bureaucratic confusion in peacetime was proving to be essential versatility in war. Combat engineers were adapting faster than anyone expected, doing whatever the situation demanded with equal expertise. The bridges rose as quickly as they'd fallen, testament to engineering skill that could create or destroy with the same tools and the same precision. December the 17th, 1944, 0600 hours. St. Vith, Belgium. Major Robert Moore, commanding officer of the 81st Engineer Combat Battalion, examined a map showing 7 roads converging on this small Belgian town. 7 roads meant St. Vith was a critical hub for any German advance westward. Controlling St. Vith meant controlling movement through the central Ardennes. Moore's engineers had been conducting routine road maintenance in this sector for 2 months. They knew every kilometer of those 7 roads, every bridge, every culvert, every place where terrain channeled traffic. That knowledge was about to become the foundation of a defensive operation that would buy American forces 6 irreplaceable days. Moore received orders at 0700, establish defensive positions around St. Vith, coordinate with arriving 7th Armored Division, delay German advance by all means available. The orders didn't specify how long to hold. Moore assumed that meant hold as long as physically possible. The coordination between multiple engineer battalions at St. Vith emerged organically, rather than through formal planning. The 81st Engineers were joined by the 168th, 202nd, 44th, and 299th Engineer Combat Battalions, 5 separate units that had never trained together, operating under different division and corps headquarters, suddenly required to function as unified defensive force. There was no predetermined command structure for multi-battalion engineer operations. Major Moore became de facto coordinator by virtue of arriving first and establishing communication with other battalion commanders. By December 18th, the 5 engineer battalions were operating under informal but effective unified command, sharing intelligence, coordinating obstacle placement, integrating defensive fires. The defensive concept that emerged was pure engineering translated to warfare. Create a perimeter of interlocking obstacles so dense, so complex, that German forces would be forced to reduce it systematically rather than bypassing it. Engineers positioned roadblocks not individually, but in depth, 3 to 5 obstacles per road, separated by sufficient distance that clearing one didn't expose the next. They laid minefields that channeled German forces into predetermined kill zones, where American anti-tank guns and artillery could engage with maximum effect. They demolished bridges not just at the perimeter, but in depth, removing crossing capability on routes that Germans might use to bypass the main defensive positions. The result was a defensive zone rather than a defensive line. 15 square miles of Belgian countryside transformed into an obstacle course designed by men who understood obstacle warfare better than anyone in the American military. December 19th, the defensive perimeter was taking shape with impressive speed. 600 roadblocks, 47 bridge demolitions, 15,000 mines. The numbers represented perhaps the most intensive obstacle emplacement in American military history, accomplished in 72 hours by approximately 3,000 combat engineers working around the clock. The density of obstacles achieved was extraordinary. 1 obstacle per 50 meters of road in some sectors versus standard doctrine calling for 1 per 200 meters. German reconnaissance probing the St. Vith perimeter reported back to division headquarters with assessments that seemed almost incredulous. American defensive preparations suggest multi-division force. Obstacle density exceeds anything encountered in Western campaign. Estimate reduction will require deliberate operations with full engineer support. But the Germans didn't have time for deliberate operations. The offensive timetable required rapid advance, bypassing strong points, maintaining momentum. St. Vith was supposed to be captured on December 17th or 18th, a quick reduction that would open the road network for exploitation. Instead, it was December 19th, and German forces were still trying to crack the perimeter. The 62nd Volksgrenadier Division attempted a coordinated assault on December 19th, hitting the perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. They encountered defensive positions that seemed designed specifically to defeat their attack. Mines where they attempted to concentrate armor, roadblocks positioned to break up infantry formations, machine gun positions sited to create interlocking fire that prevented maneuver. The attack stalled with heavy casualties and negligible gain. December 21st. The situation inside the St. Vith perimeter was becoming untenable. German forces had not broken through, but they had established encirclement. American forces, remnants of 7th Armored Division, scattered infantry units, the 5 engineer battalions were surrounded in a shrinking pocket. Ammunition was running low, food was scarce, German artillery hammered positions continuously. The logical decision was withdrawal before the pocket collapsed completely. But withdrawal through encirclement required opening escape routes that German forces had closed. Engineers would need to clear their own obstacles, create passages through German lines, blow demolitions behind the withdrawing force to prevent pursuit. It was an engineering problem as complex as the defense had been. The withdrawal from St. Vith on December 22nd and 23rd demonstrated engineer versatility at operational level. The 168th Engineers led the withdrawal, clearing lanes through American minefields that they had laid days earlier. They operated in darkness, using mine detectors to locate mines they had installed without proper mapping, working under German observation and fire to create passages for vehicles and infantry. Behind the main force, the 81st Engineers established successive rearguard positions, delaying German pursuit through the same obstacle techniques they had used in defense. Each rearguard position held for 2 to 4 hours, then withdrew to the next prepared position, while demolitions collapsed bridges and destroyed roads behind them. The withdrawal was fighting retreat, conducted with engineer precision, measured, controlled, systematically denying German forces the rapid exploitation they needed. By December 23rd evening, American forces had escaped the St. Vith pocket and established new defensive positions 15 kilometers west. Behind them, St. Vith burned. The Germans had the town, but not the victory they needed. The 6-day defense had bought time for American forces to establish the Meuse River defensive line that would ultimately contain the German offensive. The delay had thrown German timetables into disarray. Field Marshal Model, examining situation maps on December 24th, could see that his offensive had already failed, even though fighting continued. The penetration hadn't reached the Meuse. Fuel exhaustion was immobilizing German armor. Allied reinforcements were arriving faster than German forces could advance. And everywhere on the map, red circles indicated where engineer obstacles were channeling, delaying, stopping German movement. The price paid for the St. Vith defense was measured in engineer casualties that would gut unit effectiveness for months. The 81st Engineer Combat Battalion entered the battle with 593 men and left with 247, 58% casualties. The 168th, 202nd, 44th, and 299th all suffered similar rates. Engineer battalions that had been full strength at the offensive start were reduced to company-size effective forces. The specialization that made combat engineers valuable also made casualties difficult to replace. Losing an infantryman meant needing a replacement with basic combat training. Losing a combat engineer meant needing a replacement with basic combat training, plus technical skills as in demolitions, bridging, mine warfare, construction, specializations that required months to develop. The engineer casualties at St. Vith represented loss of expertise that couldn't be rapidly reconstituted, but the strategic effect of the St. Vith stand was beyond question. German planning had assumed St. Vith would fall in one day, opening 7 roads for exploitation. Instead, it held for 6 days, during which German forces were funneled onto fewer routes, creating traffic congestion that multiplied delays. The 7th Armored Division received a Presidential Unit Citation for the defense of St. Vith, recognition of tenacious infantry fighting. The 5 engineer battalions that made the defense possible received nothing comparable. Their contribution was considered normal engineering support rather than exceptional combat action. The lack of recognition reflected broader patterns in how military culture assessed contributions. Heroic last stands by infantry were celebrated. Systematic obstacle warfare by engineers was acknowledged but not celebrated. Yet the engineers understood what they had accomplished. They'd turned a transportation hub into a fortress, held it against everything the Germans committed, then withdrawn intact when the position became untenable. They'd done this using engineer expertise applied to infantry missions, dual identity merged into single purpose. The St. Vith engineers proved that technical knowledge combined with tactical improvisation could achieve effects that pure combat prowess couldn't match. They didn't need citations to know they'd done something extraordinary. The fact that American forces had 6 additional days to prepare defenses, that German offensive momentum had shattered against Belgian town, defended by engineers, that Hitler's timetable had become irrelevant. Those were the only recognition that mattered. February 3rd, 1945. Washington, D.C. Colonel Theron Weaver of the War Department's Operational Research Section spread maps across a conference table, each one marked with colored pins representing engineer actions during the Battle of the Bulge, red pins for bridge demolitions, blue pins for roadblocks, yellow pins for minefields, black pins for defensive positions where engineers fought as infantry. The density of pins made some map sections nearly solid with color. Weaver's team had spent 6 weeks analyzing after-action reports, interviewing commanders, examining German documents captured during the counteroffensive. Their mission was straightforward: quantify the combat engineer contribution to American defensive success. The answer emerging from their analysis was one that Weaver initially didn't believe. According to the mathematics, engineers had contributed more to stopping the German offensive than any other single branch. More than infantry, more than armor, more than artillery or air power. The analysis began with German planning documents captured at 5th Panzer Army headquarters. These revealed the original timeline for the offensive with painful precision. Meuse River crossings were scheduled for December 18th through 19th, 48 to 72 hours after the initial attack. Antwerp was targeted for December the 22nd through 23rd. The plan required maintaining an advance rate of approximately 15 to 20 kilometers per day, sustained over 7 days of continuous operations. German planners had calculated fuel requirements, ammunition consumption, casualty replacement, everything except the systematic resistance they would encounter from American combat engineers. The captured documents contained almost no mention of potential engineer interference. It was an oversight that would prove catastrophic. Weaver's team began by calculating delays attributable to specific engineer actions. Bridge demolitions were easiest to quantify because German after-action reports meticulously documented each encounter with missing infrastructure. The Trois Ponts demolitions on December the 17th forced Kampfgruppe Piper onto alternate routes, adding 18 hours to their advance toward the Meuse. The Stavelot Bridge demolition added 6 hours. Chenou added 4 hours. Across the northern shoulder of the offensive, 11 major bridge demolitions created a cumulative delay of 73 hours, more than 3 full days subtracted from German advance. In the central sector, where Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army operated, 23 bridge demolitions created 68 hours of cumulative delay. The southern sector showed 52 hours of delay from engineer demolitions. The total was staggering: 193 hours of delay across 3 attack sectors, averaging 64 hours per sector. Roadblocks presented more complex analysis because their effects were diffuse and cumulative, rather than discrete and measurable. Weaver's team developed a methodology based on German unit movement logs. They identified every instance where German forces reported delays due to obstacles, calculated the time consumed clearing or bypassing each obstacle, and aggregated the data. The results showed that engineer roadblocks created an average delay of 2.7 hours per obstacle encountered. With 892 major roadblocks documented across the Ardennes front, the cumulative delay exceeded 2,400 hours. But this simple multiplication didn't capture the full effect, because roadblocks forced detours that created additional delays. German units diverted onto secondary roads encountered worse conditions, narrower tracks, steeper grades, poorer surfaces, that reduced advance rates even after clearing the original obstacle. Minefield analysis relied on German casualty reports and equipment loss documentation. Engineers had laid approximately 125,000 mines during the offensive's first 10 days. German records indicated mine-related casualties across all sectors averaged 12 to 18% of total armor losses. Weaver's team calculated that mines destroyed or disabled approximately 270 German armored vehicles during the battle. But the analysis revealed that mine effectiveness extended beyond simple attrition. German forces encountering suspected minefields slowed dramatically. often calling forward engineer units for methodical clearance. The average time consumed by mine clearance operations was 4 to 6 hours per suspected minefield. With dozens of minefields encountered, the cumulative delay rivaled that from bridge demolitions. The analysis became more speculative when addressing engineered defensive operations where they'd fought as infantry. How do you quantify the effect of 143 engineers holding Malmedy against forces that might have bypassed the position entirely? Weaver's team approached this by examining what German forces could have accomplished if positions like Malmedy, Bugenbach, and Saint-Vith had fallen quickly. The Saint-Vith calculation was most straightforward. German planning documents showed that Saint-Vith was supposed to fall on December the 17th, opening 7 roads for exploitation. It actually fell on December 23rd after defenders withdrew, a 6-day delay. Those 6 days allowed American forces to establish the Meuse River defensive line that ultimately contained the offensive. Without the Saint-Vith delay, German forces might have reached the Meuse before adequate defenses existed. The engineer contribution at Saint-Vith alone potentially determined whether the German offensive succeeded or failed. February 15th. Weaver presented preliminary findings to the Chief of Engineers and his staff. The numbers were striking enough that Weaver emphasized they represented conservative estimates. Bridge demolitions created minimum 73 hours delay on the northern route, 68 hours center, 52 hours south. Roadblocks added 30 to 40 hours additional delay per route. Minefields contributed another 20 to 30 hours through clearance operations and casualty effects. Engineered defensive operations at key points like Saint-Vith bought 6 days, 144 hours. The cumulative effect ranges from 160 to 200 hours, depending on sector. 7 to 8 days of delay that German planning never anticipated. He paused, letting the numbers settle. German fuel exhaustion occurred at precisely the point where engineer delays exceeded planning margins. Correlation appears causal, not coincidental. The Chief of Engineers asked the critical question, "Are you saying engineers stopped the German offensive?" Weaver chose his words carefully. "I'm saying engineer actions created delays that exceeded German planning margins in every sector. German forces ran out of fuel and time simultaneously. Our analysis shows that without engineered demolitions, roadblocks, and minefields, German lead elements would have reached the Meuse River approximately December 20th to 22nd, within their planning timeline. With engineer delays, German forces never reached the Meuse. The offensive failed not because it was stopped through direct combat, but because it was slowed beyond the point where success remained possible. The implications were profound and uncomfortable. American military culture celebrated decisive combat, infantry assaults, tank battles, heroic last stands. Engineer obstacle warfare was technical, methodical, unglamorous. Yet the analysis suggested that unglamorous technical operations had achieved strategic effects that glamorous combat hadn't. Infantry had fought courageously at Bastogne and received recognition through presidential unit citations and extensive publicity. Engineers had fought equally courageously at Saint-Vith, Malmedy, and dozens of other positions while simultaneously executing the obstacle warfare campaign that broke German offensive momentum. Their contribution was larger. Their recognition was minimal. March 1945. The final operational research report on engineer effectiveness during the Bulge was classified and filed. Its conclusions never reached public awareness. The report documented that combat engineers constituted approximately 4% of American forces engaged, but generated 35 to 40% of the defensive effects that stopped the German offensive. The force multiplication was extraordinary. Each engineer generated tactical effects equivalent to 8 to 10 infantrymen through combination of technical expertise and combat capability. The report recommended fundamental changes to engineer organization, training, and doctrine. Some recommendations were implemented, others disappeared into bureaucratic processes, but the fundamental finding remained. The Battle of the Bulge had been won not primarily through traditional combat, but through engineering warfare. Bridges destroyed, roads blocked, mines laid, terrain transformed into weapon. The combat engineers had turned Belgium into a maze, removed German freedom of movement, created delays that accumulated into strategic failure. They had done this while fighting as infantry when necessary, dying at rates exceeding infantry casualties, receiving recognition far below their contribution. The mathematics didn't lie. The engineers had won the battle that mattered. History would forget this fact, preferring stories of infantry heroism to calculations of cumulative delay. But the numbers remained, preserved in classified reports, testament to victory achieved through slide rules and explosives, precision and courage, construction expertise converted to destruction capability. The engineers knew what they'd accomplished. The analysis confirmed it. That would have to be enough. January 23, 1945, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The U.S. Army Engineers School. Captain Robert Conlin stood before a classroom of engineer officer candidates, still wearing the same uniform he'd worn during the Bulge, and began his lecture with a statement that would have been heresy 3 months earlier. Everything we taught you about combat engineer operations is wrong, not incorrect, wrong. The field manuals assume conditions that don't exist in actual combat. The doctrine assumes time and resources you won't have. Today I'm going to teach you what actually works, based on 6 weeks of doing everything the manuals said we couldn't do. The students accustomed to buy the book instruction from career officers who'd never heard shots fired leaned forward. Conlin had their attention. He also had permission from the engineer school commandant to teach reality instead of theory. The doctrinal violations began with bridge demolitions. Field Manual 3-34, Engineer Field Data, specified that bridge demolitions required 4 to 6 hours of preparation. Engineers were supposed to calculate precise charge placements, drill holes in structural members, emplace explosives with mathematical precision, install redundant firing systems, test continuity, then execute on command from higher headquarters. Conlin described reality. Trois points. We had 45 minutes from when German armor was reported approaching until we needed that bridge down. No time for calculations. We use pre-position charges from earlier preparation. No time for redundant systems. Single firing circuit. Hope it works. No time for orders from higher. Battalion commander made the call based on his assessment. We violated every procedure in the manual. The bridge dropped perfectly. Piper's offensive stalled. Sometimes violating doctrine is the only way to accomplish the mission. Minefield doctrine was equally divorced from Bulge reality. The manual specified that minefields required 3 to 4 days of preparation, including detailed survey, precise plotting, installation at regulation depth with regulation spacing, comprehensive mapping, marking with warning signs. Engineers in the Bulge had laid 125,000 mines in 10 days across terrain they often couldn't properly survey. Conlin showed photographs of nuisance minefields, irregular patterns with no logic except slow the Germans. He explained the daisy chain technique that linked multiple mines for simultaneous detonation. He discussed surface-laying mines in frozen ground and camouflaging them with snow. Every one of these techniques violates field manual procedures, he acknowledged. Every one of them worked. The Germans encountered mines everywhere. They became cautious, slow, consumed time, clearing obstacles. Mission accomplished through doctrine violation. The most significant doctrinal heresy was the concept of engineers fighting as infantry for extended periods. Pre-war doctrine limited engineer combat operations to 48 hours maximum before relief by infantry units. The assumption was that engineers lacked infantry training and staying power for sustained combat. The Bulge destroyed this assumption. Company A of the 291st Engineers held Malmedy for 9 days. The St. Vith Engineers fought for 6 days. Multiple engineer units spent weeks in frontline positions, functioning as infantry while maintaining engineer capabilities. Conlin addressed this directly. The doctrine says we can't sustain infantry operations beyond 2 days. We sustain them for weeks. Why? Because we're not pure infantry, but we're not pure support either. We're hybrid. We fight from positions we've prepared with engineer expertise. We use obstacles we've created. We employ weapons heavier than standard infantry. The dual identity isn't weakness, it's advantage. Doctrine hasn't caught up to this reality. February 1945. The engineer school began incorporating Bulge lessons into curriculum despite absence of formal doctrine changes. Instructors taught emergency demolition techniques alongside standard procedures. Mine warfare training emphasized rapid deployment as well as deliberate installation. Combat training increased from 3 weeks to 7 weeks of basic engineer courses. The changes were unofficial, implemented by instructors who'd fought in the Bulge and understood that peacetime doctrine couldn't survive contact with actual war. Major Lawrence Moyer, supervising curriculum revision, captured the transition in a memo. "We are teaching two doctrines simultaneously, the official doctrine as published in field manuals and the actual doctrine as practiced in combat. Students must understand both and know when to apply each." The Bulge proved that rigid adherence to official doctrine gets men killed. Intelligent deviation based on situation assessment keeps them alive. The weapons and equipment modifications reflected similar doctrinal evolution. Standard engineer companies in 1944 carried limited infantry weapons, primarily rifles with a few machine guns and bazookas. Post-Bulge engineer companies were being reorganized with substantially increased firepower, more .50 caliber machine guns, more bazookas, more automatic weapons. The changes reflected recognition that engineers needed to fight as well as build. Captain Pergrin of the 291st Engineers had submitted detailed recommendations for equipment changes. "Give each engineer company the heavy weapons of an infantry weapons platoon. We'll use them. We proved at Malmedy that engineers with infantry weapons can hold infantry positions. Make it official. Give us the tools to fight, and we'll fight better." But some senior officers resisted the doctrinal changes, arguing that making engineers more combat-capable would reduce their engineering effectiveness. The debate revealed fundamental disagreement about engineer identity and purpose. Were engineers primarily builders who occasionally fought, or fighters who occasionally built? Lieutenant General Eugene Raybould, Chief of Engineers, addressed this at a March 1945 conference. "The question is falsely framed. Combat engineers are both. The Bulge proved we can fight and build simultaneously. We demolished bridges under fire. We constructed bridges under fire. We laid mines while defending positions. We cleared mines while attacking. The dual capability isn't compromise. It's multiplication of effectiveness. Our doctrine must reflect this." The most difficult doctrinal question was how to formalize improvisation. Engineer success in the Bulge came partly from violating established procedures when situations demanded it. But how do you write doctrine that says, "Violate doctrine when necessary"? How do you train soldiers to follow rules while simultaneously teaching them when to break those rules? Captain Conlin struggled with this in his engineer school lectures. "I can teach you the techniques we used. I can't teach you the judgment to know when those techniques are appropriate. That comes from experience. My advice, learn the doctrine thoroughly so you understand what you're violating and why. Then trust yourself to make field decisions based on situation, not manual. The manual is guidance, not gospel." By summer 1945, new field manuals were in development incorporating Bulge lessons. FM 5-6, Operations of Engineer Units, would include chapters on emergency demolitions, rapid minefield installation, sustained engineer combat operations. The new doctrine legitimized improvisation that had been unofficial in December. It acknowledged that combat engineering was inherently improvisational because battlefield conditions never matched planning assumptions. The doctrinal evolution represented recognition that the Bulge hadn't been exception, but preview. Modern warfare moved too fast for deliberate engineering operations. Engineers needed to act quickly, with incomplete information, making the best decisions possible with available time and resources. But something was lost in the doctrinal transition. The careful, methodical approach to engineering, precise calculations, thorough preparation, multiple redundancies, had value beyond combat application. Engineer culture had always emphasized getting things right, accepting no shortcuts, maintaining professional standards regardless of time pressure. The new doctrine emphasized getting things done quickly even if not perfectly. Sergeant Harry Katz, the mathematics teacher turned combat engineer, worried about the cultural shift. "We're teaching speed over precision. That's necessary in combat, but dangerous in peace. Engineers who learn to cut corners in war might cut corners in peace, building bridges that fail or installations that collapse. We need to teach both approaches, precision when time allows, speed when survival demands, without confusing which context applies. His concern highlighted the broader tension between engineering as profession and engineering as combat skill. The Bulge had tilted the balance toward combat effectiveness. The long-term consequences for engineer professional culture remained unclear. But the immediate lesson was undeniable. Doctrine written in peacetime often failed in war. The Bulge had proven that desperate improvisation could outperform careful planning. The engineers who'd violated every rule and won anyway were now writing new rules based on their violations. Whether those new rules would survive the next war was questioned for a future nobody in early 1945 could predict. For now, doctrine was being rewritten in blood and experience. The engineers who'd learned through survival were teaching others to survive the same way. Violate the manual when the manual doesn't work. Fight like infantry when fighting is required. Build like engineers when building is required. Be both simultaneously, without apology. That was the new doctrine. That was the Bulge legacy. December 20th, 1944. Minus 20 degrees Celsius. Private Donald Jakeway of the 159th Engineer Combat Battalion knelt in snow trying to convince a block of TNT to function at temperatures never mentioned in training manuals. The explosive felt like wood in his hands, rigid, unyielding, cold enough to burn exposed skin. Standard TNT became unreliable below minus 10 degrees, losing impact sensitivity, requiring higher detonation energy, sometimes failing completely. Jakeway's mission was to blow a roadblock after German forces passed, denying them retreat route. But his TNT was frozen. His blasting caps might not generate sufficient detonation, and he had perhaps 10 minutes before German armor arrived. He made a decision that would have horrified demolitions instructors. He unwrapped the TNT, opened his coat, and held the explosive against his body, using his own warmth to thaw it enough for reliable detonation. The winter of 1944 through 45 was the coldest in Belgian memory. Temperatures dropped to minus 25 Celsius at night, rarely climbing above minus 10 during daytime. For infantry, this created misery, frostbite, immobility, reduced combat effectiveness. For combat engineers, it created technical problems that fundamentally altered their capabilities. Frozen ground prevented proper mine installation. Cold weather made explosives unreliable. Ice-covered rivers complicated bridging operations. Equipment designed for temperate conditions failed in Arctic cold. The engineers had to adapt every technique, improvise solutions to problems that training had never addressed, and accomplish their missions despite environmental conditions that made standard procedures impossible. Mine laying in frozen ground became exercise in frustration and innovation. Doctrine required anti-tank mines buried 15 centimeters deep to prevent detection and provide optimal detonation geometry. But ground frozen 30 to 45 centimeters deep defeated entrenching tools, picks, even powered augers. Engineers initially tried using explosive charges to blast mine holes, a technique that worked but consumed explosives faster than they could be resupplied. Then they discovered thermite charges. Incendiary devices designed for destroying equipment could thaw ground enough for digging. A thermite charge burned at over 2,000 degrees Celsius, melting ice and thawing earth in a 2-meter radius. Engineers began using thermite as ground preparation tool, burning charges to create installable mine sites. The technique was dangerous, thermite couldn't be extinguished once ignited, and slow, but it worked. December 22nd brought temperatures below minus 25 Celsius, cold enough to cause equipment failures that cascaded into mission degradation. Vehicle engines wouldn't start without extensive preheating. Hydraulic systems on bulldozers froze solid. Radio batteries died within hours. Blasting caps became unreliable because the electrical resistance of wiring changed at extreme cold. Engineers learned through trial and error that batteries had to be kept warm, literally inside coats against skin until moment of use. Detonation wire needed to be tested immediately before firing because cold made connections brittle and unreliable. Every technical operation acquired additional steps to compensate for temperature effects. The human cost of winter operations was measured in frostbite casualties that sometimes exceeded combat wounds. The 296th Engineer Combat Battalion reported that in 1 week of operations, 34% of casualties were frostbite versus 22% from enemy action. Engineers working with metal tools and equipment in extreme cold risked freezing injuries every minute. Steel tools became cold enough to freeze to skin instantly. Touching metal with bare hands meant leaving skin behind. Engineers learned to work with gloves on, accepting reduced dexterity as lesser evil than frostbite. Bridge construction became particularly hazardous because steel bridge components reached ambient temperature. Men handling frozen steel suffered instant frostbite on contact. Some bridge construction crews experienced 50% frostbite casualty rates. Mission accomplished, but half the crew evacuated for cold injuries. January 4th, 1945. Engineers attempting bridge construction across the Our River encountered ice conditions that field manuals didn't address. The river had partially frozen, creating ice flows that threatened bridge pontoons while not being solid enough to support vehicle traffic. Engineers needed to break up ice flows before launching the bridge, but doing so created additional hazards as broken ice accumulated around bridge supports. The solution was improvised. Engineers used thermite charges underwater to melt ice around pontoon positions. The technique worked, but created new danger. Thermite underwater produced steam explosions that could injure nearby engineers. Lieutenant Colonel Fraser, supervising the operation, made the calculation every engineer officer faced repeatedly. Accept known risk to accomplish critical mission, or refuse risk and fail mission. He accepted the risk. The bridge was built. 3 engineers suffered steam burns. The mission succeeded. The environmental conditions also created unexpected tactical advantages. Frozen ground that prevented proper mine burial also prevented German mine clearing operations. Mechanical mine clearance equipment, flails and rollers designed to detonate mines by applying pressure, worked poorly on frozen ground where mines couldn't be properly buried. Surface-laid mines camouflaged with snow were actually harder to detect than properly buried mines in normal soil. German engineers accustomed to temperate European conditions struggled with frozen ground as much as Americans. The environmental difficulties were symmetrical. Both sides suffered equally, but Americans had been operating in the terrain longer and had developed more workarounds. January 7th. The cold reached its peak with temperatures dropping to -30 Celsius. At this extreme, metal became brittle, rubber components shattered, lubricants solidified, human endurance reached its limit. Engineer operations degraded toward minimum essential activities. Bridge maintenance continued because bridges couldn't be abandoned. Mine laying continued because defensive positions needed obstacles. But the pace slowed dramatically. Work that would take 4 hours at 0 degrees took 12 hours at -30. The mathematics of temperature and productivity were unforgiving. Engineers adapted by working in shorter shifts with more frequent warming breaks, accepting lower productivity as alternative to mass frostbite casualties. The medical understanding of cold injuries was primitive in December 1944. Frostbite treatment consisted primarily of gradual rewarming and hoping for recovery. Many engineers suffered permanent injury, lost toes, fingers, reduced manual dexterity that ended their engineering careers. Some cold injuries were subtle and delayed. Engineers working in extreme cold for extended periods developed circulatory problems that appeared only later. The long-term medical cost of the Bulge's winter operations wouldn't be fully understood for years. But the engineers continued working because missions remained critical, regardless of temperature. They thawed explosives with body heat. They broke frozen ground with thermite charges. They built bridges from steel cold enough to freeze skin. They laid mines in conditions that made proper installation impossible. They adapted every procedure to accommodate cold, accepting reduced effectiveness as price of continuing operations. The winter that should have stopped all engineering activity instead became testing ground for Arctic combat engineering. Techniques developed in desperation during December 1944 would inform Arctic warfare doctrine for decades. The engineers learned what was possible at -25 Celsius because they had no choice except to keep working or fail their missions. They chose to work. The frozen ground made everything harder, but nothing impossible. The bitter cold was another enemy, as dangerous as German artillery, more pervasive than German infantry. The engineers fought it the same way they fought everything, with technical knowledge, improvisation, and refusal to accept that conditions made missions impossible. If the ground was frozen, use thermite. If explosives were unreliable, thaw them with body heat. If metal was too cold to touch, work with gloves and accept slower pace. Every problem had solution, even if that solution was crude, dangerous, and exhausting. The engineers found those solutions because finding them was their job. The frozen ground became another challenge to overcome through engineering ingenuity applied to impossible conditions. They overcame it, mission by mission, casualty by casualty, throughout the longest winter anyone could remember. January 3rd, 1945, 0800 hours. Spa, Belgium. 1st Army Engineer Headquarters. Colonel William Carter spread maps across the conference table, showing 3 Allied armies preparing to counterattack. 1st Army from the north, 3rd Army from the south, British XXX Corps from the northwest. Each army required engineer support for offensive operations, bridges to cross rivers, roads to move supplies, mines cleared from areas American forces had mined 3 weeks earlier. The engineer groups gathered at Spa faced a mission of staggering complexity. Simultaneously remove defensive obstacles they had created during the defensive phase, repair infrastructure Germans had destroyed, and construct new infrastructure to support offensive operations. All of this while some engineer units were still engaged in frontline combat. Carter looked at his staff officers and spoke the question everyone was thinking. Can we actually do this? The answer would determine whether Allied counteroffensive succeeded or bogged down in logistical failure. The engineer strength available for counteroffensive support was both impressive and barely adequate. 23 combat engineer battalions, approximately 14,000 men, plus 14 general service engineer regiments, totaling another 21,000 men. Total engineer strength approaching 35,000. This seemed like overwhelming force until Carter's staff calculated mission requirements. 87,000 mines to remove from American-laid minefields. 600 roadblocks to clear from roads Americans had blocked. 47 bridge sites to reopen where Americans had demolished bridges. Plus, entirely new missions. 67 bridges to construct at sites Germans had demolished. 340 miles of road to improve or construct for offensive supply routes. 15 major supply dumps to establish. The mathematics suggested engineer forces were actually insufficient for the mission. Carter made the decision that would define engineer operations for the next month. We do everything simultaneously, no sequential operations. Every engineer unit works every mission in their sector. We'll succeed through parallel operations or we'll fail completely. But we're not doing this slowly. The mine clearance operations began immediately, targeting minefields that American forces had laid during December defensive operations. The irony was bitter. Engineers risking their lives to remove mines they'd risked their lives to install 3 weeks earlier. But the mines that had delayed German offensive now blocked American counteroffensive. Clearance couldn't wait. The 202nd Engineers, who'd laid 4,000 mines in the Bitgenbach sector, now led clearance operations in the same sector. The challenge was that 30% of those mines were improperly documented. Engineers had laid mines in darkness, in haste, often without time to record exact locations. Now they were clearing the same areas using mine detectors, probing techniques, and luck. January the 5th. Sergeant Walter Butler, who'd commanded the heroic roadblock defense in December, found himself supervising roadblock removal. The obstacles he'd built to stop Germans now stopped American armor. His crew dismantled obstacles with the same precision they'd used installing them, felling trees cut down and dragged aside, mines removed and stacked for disposal, craters filled with bulldozers, barriers dismantled, The work was dangerous because some obstacles had been booby-trapped against German clearance. Engineers clearing American obstacles encountered American booby traps and suffered casualties. 4 engineers of the 168th Battalion were wounded removing obstacles their own unit had emplaced, injured by demolitions they had installed. The casualties illustrated the strange nature of offensive pivot, fighting your own defenses, injured by your own weapons, clearing obstacles you'd built. The bridge reconstruction operations were even more complex. American engineers had demolished bridges with precision, designed to drop spans while preserving abutments for eventual rebuilding. But eventual had meant someday after the war, not 3 weeks later. Now engineers were rebuilding bridges from the same abutments, sometimes using salvage materials from the original spans, constructing on sites they'd destroyed. At Stavelot, Captain Frank Ria supervised reconstruction of the Amblev Bridge his company had demolished December 17th. The bridge reconstruction took 48 hours of intensive work. Ria stood on the completed bridge, looking at stone abutments that showed blast damage from his own demolition charges, and felt the strange satisfaction of having come full circle. "We blew it perfectly," he told his executive officer. "That made rebuilding easier. If we demolished it poorly, we'd be starting from scratch." The new construction missions were equally demanding. Allied offensive operations required crossing sites at locations where no bridges existed, rivers too minor for permanent peacetime bridges, or sites where German demolitions had been so thorough that rebuilding wasn't feasible. Engineers constructed 67 new bridges during January, averaging more than 3 bridges per day across all engineer units. The construction pace was unprecedented. Peacetime bridge construction took weeks or months. Combat bridge construction compressed that to hours or days. The 51st Engineers constructed 3 separate bridges in 5 days, moving from site to site, building, then moving again. The tempo was exhausting, but essential. Without those bridges, Allied armor couldn't advance. Without advancing armor, counteroffensive stalled. January 8, 1945. The route clearance teams demonstrated the integration of multiple engineer skills into single operations. These composite units, typically company strength, combine mine clearance specialists, demolition experts, bridge builders, and heavy equipment operators into mobile problem-solving formations. A route clearance team, approaching a contested road, would first clear mines, then remove roadblocks, then bridge any obstacles, all as continuous operation. The 111th Engineer Group developed standardized procedures for route clearance that became template for other units. Reconnaissance element identified obstacles, mine clearance section removed mines, demolition section cleared roadblocks, bridging section built crossings, heavy equipment section improved road surfaces. The 5-step process turned impassable roads into usable supply routes in 8 to 12 hours. The innovation that enabled offensive pivot was what engineers called reverse engineering, using intimate knowledge of how they'd built defensive positions to dismantle those positions efficiently. Engineers who'd surveyed minefields could estimate mine locations even without maps. Engineers who'd positioned roadblocks understood the pattern and could predict where additional obstacles would be located. Engineers who demolished bridges knew exactly where charges had been placed and could assess structural damage quickly. The knowledge worked both ways. Building expertise informed destruction. Destruction expertise informed reconstruction. The dual capability wasn't duplication, but multiplication. Each skill enhanced the other. By January 20th, the statistics of offensive pivot were impressive and daunting. 50,000 mines removed from American minefields. 400 roadblocks cleared, 32 bridges rebuilt at sites of American demolitions, 41 new bridges constructed at sites where bridges hadn't existed, 260 miles of road improved to support heavy traffic. The numbers represented perhaps the most intensive engineer operations in American military history, accomplished in 17 days by forces that were simultaneously recovering from combat casualties and still engaged in frontline positions. The cost was measured in continued casualties. Engineers clearing mines suffered mine casualties. Engineers building bridges took artillery fire. Engineers improving roads were targeted by German patrols. The offensive pivot wasn't rotation to rear areas for rest. It was transition from defensive to offensive engineering while maintaining all combat commitments. January 25th. First Army units re-entered St. Vith, on roads cleared by engineers, crossing rivers on bridges built by engineers, advancing through areas demined by engineers. The offensive that began January 3rd was succeeding partly because engineer support was succeeding. The infrastructure that had channeled German offensive into failure now channeled Allied offensive toward victory. And the engineers who defended Belgium in December were rebuilding it in January, removing obstacles they had created, constructing infrastructure where Germans had removed it, enabling the war to move east toward Germany. The offensive pivot was complete. The mission had changed from deny the enemy to support the advance. The engineers executed both missions with equal expertise. They'd proven they could destroy and build, often simultaneously, always effectively. The dual identity wasn't confusion. It was the definition of combat engineer, equally capable of construction and destruction, switching between them as mission required, excelling at both because the technical knowledge underlying each was fundamentally the same. Understanding how things are built informs how they can be destroyed. Understanding destruction informs reconstruction. The engineers possessed that understanding in full. They used it to win defensive battles in December and offensive battles in January. Same skills, different applications, identical excellence. January 25th, 1945. Malmedy, Belgium. Chaplain Francis Sampson stood in frozen mud, conducting a memorial service for the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. 61 wooden crosses marked fresh graves. 127 additional names read aloud, wounded seriously enough for evacuation, some who would never return to duty. From 143 men who defended Malmedy's perimeter, only 82 remained effective for duty. Captain William Pergrin stood at attention while Chaplain Sampson read each name, and behind the captain, the surviving engineers of Company A listened to the roll call of their dead. These weren't anonymous casualties. These were men they'd lived with for months, fought beside for weeks, watched die in positions often mere meters away. The statistics that higher headquarters recorded as acceptable combat losses were, at battalion level, the destruction of a unit's identity and capability. The casualty figures for combat engineers during the Battle of the Bulge had been quietly mounting since December 16th, but only in late January did staff officers compile comprehensive numbers that revealed the magnitude of engineer losses. Approximately 18,000 combat engineers had been committed to operations in the Ardennes between December 16th and January 25th. Of those, 4,200 were casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or evacuated for severe frostbite. The 23% casualty rate exceeded the 19% rate for infantry divisions engaged in the same period and far exceeded the 12% rate for armored units. The engineers, who'd been considered support troops before the battle, had suffered combat losses typical of assault infantry. The numbers validated what individual engineers had experienced, but official doctrine hadn't acknowledged. Combat engineers in the Bulge had fought as frontline troops while maintaining engineer missions. The casualty distribution revealed the dangers specific to engineer operations. 45% of casualties resulted from small arms fire and shrapnel, standard combat injuries. 28% came from artillery, reflecting the fact that engineer operations often concentrated men in predictable locations, where German artillery could target effectively. 15% were frostbite and exposure cases serious enough for evacuation. The remaining 12% came from mines and demolition accidents, engineers killed by the very weapons they employed. This last category was particularly tragic because it represented casualties from friendly or accidental causes. Engineers clearing American minefields hit American mines. Engineers conducting demolitions suffered premature detonations. Engineers handling frozen explosives experienced detonation failures that sometimes resulted in explosions during handling. The unit-level devastation was even more striking than aggregate statistics. 5 engineer companies suffered over 50% casualties during the battle. The 81st Engineer Combat Battalion, heavily engaged at St. Vith, entered the battle with 593 men and came out with 247, 58% casualties. The 168th Engineers reported 53% casualties. The 291st Company A, defending Malmedy, suffered 41%. These weren't units degraded by attrition. These were units gutted by casualties that removed more than half their effective strength. In infantry doctrine, units suffering 30% casualties were considered combat ineffective and pulled from the line. Engineer units suffering 50% casualties continued operating because engineer missions couldn't stop. February 1st. Lieutenant Robert Conlin, the officer who demolished the Trois Ponts bridges, wrote letters to families of 17 men from his company killed during the battle. The letters were personal, specific, honest about how each man died. Your son Robert was killed instantly by artillery fire while preparing bridge demolitions on December 17th. He was performing essential duties under enemy fire with courage and skill. His sacrifice contributed directly to stopping the German offensive. Conlin spent 3 days writing 17 letters, struggling to find individual meaning in deaths that felt overwhelming in aggregate. The Army provided form letters for casualty notifications, but Conlin rejected them as inadequate. These men deserve better than form letters. Their families deserved to know their sons hadn't died as anonymous statistics, but as individuals whose specific actions mattered. The awards and decorations told another story of engineer valor and official recognition. During the Battle of the Bulge, combat engineers received 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, the nation's second highest award for valor, 47 Silver Stars, 234 Bronze Stars. The numbers seemed impressive until compared to infantry awards for the same period. The 101st Airborne Division, defending Bastogne with roughly 12,000 men, received substantially more awards than all 18,000 combat engineers engaged across the entire Ardennes. The disparity reflected cultural bias rather than actual combat contribution. Heroic infantry stands fit recognized patterns of military valor. Engineer defensive operations, however tactically brilliant, didn't match traditional concepts of heroism. The casualty causes revealed the specific dangers of engineer combat. Small arms and shrapnel casualties occurred when engineers fought as infantry or worked under fire. Artillery casualties reflected the predictable nature of engineer operations. Bridge construction sites, roadblock positions, minefield emplacement areas were obvious targets for German artillery. Engineers concentrated in these areas suffered accordingly. The frostbite casualties resulted from engineer missions requiring extended exposure to extreme cold while performing manual labor. Bridge construction in sub-zero temperatures guaranteed frostbite for some percentage of workers. Mine laying in frozen ground required hours of outdoor work with limited possibility for warming breaks. Engineers chose between accepting frostbite risk or failing missions. They generally accepted the risk. The mine and demolition casualties were most painful because they represented hazards engineers should have been able to control. 3 engineers of the 202nd Battalion were killed removing mines their own platoon had laid, injured when one mine detonated while being extracted. The casualties occurred because emergency mine laying in December hadn't allowed proper mapping, forcing clearance teams to probe for mines without definite knowledge of locations. 2 engineers of the 51st Battalion died in a premature demolition when frozen blasting caps malfunctioned during bridge demolition. The investigation concluded that extreme cold had made the detonation system unreliable, but the mission required attempting the demolition despite known equipment